Hey guys. Tonight we're slipping quietly into the dim corridors of a cold medieval castle, Warwick Castle. To be exact, where the stone walls breathe out a chill that somehow feels older than memory itself. You stand there, rubbing your arms as a draft curls around your neck, and you can almost hear the clatter of wooden toys on flagstones. The soft footsteps of a girl who would one day be queen, but never quite live in the light. That girl is Anne Neville, and trust me, the childhood you're about to witness? You'd last maybe 5 minutes before begging for Wi-Fi, central heating, or at least a snack that isn't hard bread and a questionable stew. Seriously, you wouldn't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, go ahead and comment your location and local time. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a slow step into the heart of Anne Neville's childhood. And the first thing you notice is how the world around you seems designed not for children, but for power. You feel the weight of that immediately, those towering walls, the echoing chambers, the constant sense that someone important is always just around the corner. Little Anne grows up in this environment. Tiny footsteps clicking over stone floors. Her presence small compared to the giant reputation of her father. Richard Neville, the legendary kingmaker. You can almost picture her clutching the edge of her woolen sleeve, knowing, even if she can't name it yet, that her life will never truly be hers. You follow her through the castle's inner courtyard, where the air smells faintly of damp hay and chimney smoke. Her governess murmurs instructions, fussing over posture and etiquette, and you can't help but smirk, compared to your own childhood, where the worst pressure you faced might have been finishing homework or surviving a group project. Anne's world is like being enrolled in a leadership boot camp at age 6. Medieval childhood didn't play around. Also, fun fact, in those days, playtime often meant mock combat practice or needlework intense enough to qualify as a modern hazing ritual. But for Anne, the real challenge isn't work, it's loneliness. You feel it as clearly as you feel the cold draft curling under the wooden doors. She lives surrounded by people, knights, maids, household staff, yet almost none of them are companions. They are watchers, teachers, guards, servants, and sometimes, gossipers. The silence between their stiff phrases feels like the space between chimes of a distant bell. It's in this quiet that Anne learns to listen more than she speaks. That habit will follow her into adulthood, shaping how she moves through the world, quietly, carefully, always observing. As you drift further into her early years, you pass a narrow window overlooking the Avon River. If you lean close, you can smell wet reeds and see the reflection of clouds drifting lazily overhead. Imagine Anne perched on the ledge, hands clasped, watching boats bob downstream. Even as a child, she probably sensed that life outside the castle was different, freer, lighter, filled with trivial choices she'd never be allowed to make. Maybe that's why she loved stories. The ones whispered by the fire about queens and noblewomen who changed history. Though, as you're about to see, medieval stories conveniently left out the part where those women rarely controlled their own destinies. You continue on, the flagstones cold beneath your steps, And you hear murmurs, deep voices rising and falling in strategy conversations. Men move like storm clouds around her, bringing news of battles, treaties, shifting loyalties. You catch the words, York, Lancaster, uprising, and you feel your shoulders tighten. For Anne, this isn't background noise. This is the soundtrack of her childhood. The kind of political static that shapes her understanding of safety, family, even love. You think your family gatherings get tense? Try growing up during the Wars of the Roses. One wrong alliance, and entire families vanished from the political landscape faster than leftover pizza in a shared fridge. She learns early that nothing stays stable for long, not peace. Not alliances, not even the people around her. Her father disappears for long stretches, always off to put out fires or start them, depending on which side you ask. And yes, historians still debate the true extent of Warwick's ambition, whether he genuinely believed he was restoring rightful order or simply enjoyed being the most powerful man in England without a crown. Anne, meanwhile, is left in the care of tutors and attendants, absorbing the tension in the air like a sponge soaking up cold water. You trail Anne into the solar, where sunlight filters through stained glass in fractured colors. Here she learns to read, to stitch, to listen to the complex music of the court. She traces her fingers along parchment scrolls, the ink scent sharp and earthy. She studies heraldry, lions, roses, dragons, symbols that seem pretty to you, but to her represent real danger, real alliances, real futures. There's a moment where she pauses, gazing at the crest of Lancaster beside that of York, and you can almost hear her young voice whisper a question. Why must families fight? If you've ever asked yourself the same thing during a holiday dinner, congratulations, you and Anne have something in common. Every so often, she wanders into the great hall, where her father's retainers gather around roaring fires. The heat is comforting, but the conversations are not. Rumors swirl like wood smoke, and Anne picks up scraps. Who betrayed whom? Which nobleman fell in battle? Whether the kingmaker's newest plan will tilt the world again. One knight mentions that Warwick might soon challenge the king's authority. And you watch Anne stiffen, her small hands balling into fists. Even at her age, she understands that rebellion has consequences, and none of them tend to be gentle. There's a rarely mentioned detail about her childhood, the kind that slips into the historical margins. Anne spent long hours in the castle's quieter spaces, the chapel, the orchard, the weaving rooms. These were her refuges. It's said she had a fondness for birds, fragile creatures she would watch flit along the castle eaves. Some accounts even mention she kept a small sparrow for a time, tending it with surprising tenderness. Whether that's truth or embellishment, historians still debate, but it paints a poignant picture. A girl caring for something delicate in a world built on steel and ambition. You step into the garden beside her, and the scent of crushed thyme rises under your feet. She kneels beside a stone fountain, tracing patterns in the water. This is where she dreams, where she wonders what her life will become. You want to whisper to her that she will be queen one day. But you hesitate, because the crown she'll wear, the life she'll live, won't be the kind any child would daydream about. And as you watch her gaze at her rippling reflection, you sense it. The beginning of a life lived not in spotlight, but in shadows. The cold stone, the whispers, the loneliness, they're shaping her already. They always were. You move with Anne into a world where footsteps echo a little louder, where conversations shift from household murmurs to the deep, weighty rumble of political ambition. You feel it in the air, the pressure, the expectation, the sense that every day is shaping her into something useful rather than someone whole. Because being the daughter of Richard Neville isn't just a title. It's a condition, a fate, and as you follow her through the long corridors of Warwick Castle, you begin to understand why people called her father the Kingmaker, and why that title cast a shadow even over the life of his youngest daughter. You step into a chamber thick with parchment and map rolls. The fire crackles low, light flickering against a pair of tall figures, Warwick himself and one of his captains. They speak in clipped, urgent tones. You move closer, listening as the Kingmaker complains about the king's favoritism, the queen's meddling, the court's ingratitude. There's something almost theatrical about him. The way he gestures, pacing across rugs embroidered with battles long past. Anne watches from a corner seat, her face quiet, unreadable, but her mind absorbing every word like cold ink sinking into paper. You can sense it. She's learning that loyalty is a tool, not a virtue. Learning that kings rise and fall on the whims of men like her father. Learning, most of all, that she is part of this machinery, one more gear ready to turn whenever Warwick needs leverage. And let's be honest, compared to modern parents who pressure their kids to join the math club or learn piano, Warwick's expectations hit a little different. He doesn't want his daughters to get good grades. He wants them strategically married into alliances that can topple or restore kingdoms. You think helicopter parents are bad? Try growing up under a father who treats international diplomacy like a family hobby. As you drift through the Great Hall, the scent of roasted meat filling the air, you hear one of Warwick's retainers mutter that the Earl could make a king in one season and break him in the next. Anne is close enough to hear it. She does not flinch. She's used to these kinds of comments. The way people speak about her father like he's a force of nature, a thunderstorm or an earthquake. But what you pick up, as you watch her small hands fold together, is that she understands something even adults forget. Storms don't choose where they strike. And living close to one means you never quite feel safe. The first real sign of Warwick's ambitions shaping Anne's life comes during a stormy afternoon. You and Anne stand near the main gate as riders arrive caked in mud, shouting news that King Edward IV has married Elizabeth Woodville. A love match, they say, a secret match, a match Warwick did not arrange, approve, or even anticipate. You feel the tension coil in the courtyard like a living thing. Warwick's face hardens into something carved from ice. Anne doesn't know the details yet, not truly, but she knows enough to recognize danger. You, on the other hand, know exactly what this means. The Kingmaker has been outmaneuvered. And he's not the kind of man who tolerates that quietly. Historians still debate how deeply this betrayal cut him, whether he reacted out of personal insult or political necessity. But one thing is certain. The king's unexpected marriage sets in motion a chain of events that will pull Anne from childhood and thrust her into the brutal churn of dynastic politics. You follow Anne as Warwick's resentment festers. The castle becomes a hive of strategy. Letters flying out like arrows fired from the battlements. Anne listens from doorways as her father mutters about the Woodvilles, upstarts, manipulators, threats to the stability he worked so hard to build. Every room buzzes with speculation. Every corridor hums with gossip. It's like living inside one of those political drama shows you binge late at night. Except nobody gets a witty monologue or a guaranteed season renewal. Amid all this tension, Anne's older sister, Isabel, becomes a greater focus of Warwick's plans. You watch the two sisters walking in the garden together, their hands brushing the tops of lavender stalks. Isabel tries to stay cheerful, talking brightly about fabrics and music, but Anne sees the cracks beneath. She sees the worry, the uncertainty. She hears the whispers that Isabel may soon be married not for happiness, but for strategy. And she knows, in the quiet way she knows everything, that her turn will come too. There's an odd detail about Anne's upbringing that tends to slip into the margins. A detail you notice on a warm evening when she stands on the parapet. Wind tugging her sleeves. She doesn't fear heights, not even a little. Where other children would cling to the wall, she leans forward, eyes scanning the horizon as if she's searching for something far beyond what she can name. Some chronicles mention she had a habit of climbing the castle steps just to look out at the shifting banners of approaching parties. Whether that's poetic embellishment or genuine memory, historians continue to debate, but the image is striking. A quiet girl watching the world change from high above, knowing she will soon be part of it. The tension around her builds like an approaching storm. You feel it in the air, thick, restless, humming with the promise of upheaval. Warwick begins orchestrating alliances that make even his closest supporters uneasy. He quarrels with Edward IV, reconciles, quarrels again. He shifts loyalties from York to Lancaster with the confidence of a man who believes the world will bend to his will. And every time he moves, Anne feels the ripple. Every decision he makes tightens the invisible threads around her. One evening, you find Anne alone in the chapel, a single candle flickering by her hands. She kneels, not in childish piety, but in quiet contemplation, maybe prayer, maybe seeking strength, maybe trying to understand why her life is shaped by forces she can't control. Her breath is steady, her posture calm, but her eyes betray something else, awareness. She knows the future is coming for her faster than she'd like. You want to reach out, to reassure her, to tell her she deserves a childhood untouched by politics. But the truth is, her father is already negotiating the next step of her life. She just doesn't know the details yet. And as the candlelight dances across her face, you realize the shadow that defines her story has already begun to fall. You follow Anne out of the dim chapel and into a world that suddenly feels louder, sharper, more unstable than before. The hallways of Warwick Castle hum like a disturbed beehive. And even if you try to steady your breathing, the tension slips under your skin. Whatever childhood remained for Anne is fading fast, replaced by the restless murmur of courtiers who can sense that England is tilting toward chaos again. You walk beside her, your steps soft on the stone, feeling like you've wandered into the backstage of a political play where everyone knows their lines except her and you. Voices drift from around corners, urgent and clipped. A servant hurries past, nearly colliding with you, muttering apologies as he carries a tray of sealed letters. You hear words like uprising, betrayal, restoration, The wars of the roses are shifting yet again. And the shifting currents run right beneath Anne's feet. She doesn't stumble. She doesn't question. She listens. Always listening. It's one of the first things you notice about her. How she never reacts too quickly. How she weighs each word as though she's already imagining the consequences. You're ushered into a candlelit chamber where maps cover nearly every surface. Warwick stands before them, lines of strain carved deep around his mouth. He drags a finger across regions loyal to York, then to Lancaster, and finally to places that might simply collapse if pushed hard enough. A messenger bursts in, breathless, announcing another failed negotiation with King Edward IV. Warwick's jaw tightens. His ambitions flicker like the candle flames. And you watch the moment where irritation becomes a decision. Anne sees it too. Something is about to break. You and Anne slip away as arguments intensify behind closed doors. Down the hall, a tapestry sways from a draft. Its embroidered lions seeming to pace restlessly. You catch Anne's fingertips brushing the woven threads. Her eyes tracing the red and white roses intertwined, a symbol of unity that England hasn't lived up to in a long time. She lets the fabric fall back into place and moves on. The corridor swallowing her small silhouette. In the great hall, a group of knights gather around a long table. Their armor clinking softly. They speak of a rebellion Warwick is planning. One meant to force the king into a corner. You hear a few nervous laughs. The kind that don't reach the eyes. Someone jokes that being on Warwick's bad side is like standing in front of a catapult during target practice. Funny only until you realize you might actually be the target. Anne stiffens at the sound. Their fear, their admiration, their uncertainty, it all circles back to her father. And therefore, to her. You move toward the courtyard, where rain begins to fall in slow, heavy drops. Anne stands beneath the archway, watching the sky darken. The storm mirrors the mood inside the castle. She lifts a hand, letting the rain touch her fingertips. There's no childish wonder left in the gesture. It's more like she's testing the wind, sensing which way the world is turning. And truthfully, you get the feeling she can sense the shift better than the adults can. Sometimes quiet people hear storms long before anyone else notices the distant thunder. A servant hurries across the stones, cloak whipping in the wind, and whispers something to one of Warwick's officers. His eyes widen. The officer turns and strides back inside. You can guess what the news is. Even before Anne turns her face slightly. Listening. Yorkist forces are rallying. Edward IV is tightening his grip on the throne. This is the spark Warwick has been waiting for or dreading. It depends on whom you ask. Historians still debate whether the kingmaker acted from wounded pride, political necessity, or simply because he couldn't stand not being the man behind the crown. But whatever his motives, you feel the consequences tightening around Anne like laces on a too small bodice. Inside, the conversations grow darker. Warwick's wife, Anne Beauchamp, moves through the halls with a kind of brittle urgency. Her eyes scanning her daughters as if she's taking inventory of everything that might soon be used as collateral. You see her approach Anne, smoothing the girl's hair, whispering something soft but urgent. Anne nods, but her jaw clenches. She's beginning to understand that her life is not only her own, it is an extension of her father's ambitions. And though she meets it with quiet resolve, You sense a flicker of fear beneath the surface. One evening, during a tense supper, a messenger arrives dripping rainwater onto the rushes, his cloak plastered to his shoulders. He delivers news that Edward IV has left court in anger. Suspicious of Warwick's growing influence, the hall falls silent. Even the dogs under the table stop begging for scraps. Warwick wipes his mouth slowly, folds his hands, and says, "Then we begin." Anne lowers her gaze, but her breath catches for just a moment. You lean closer, sensing that this is the hinge on which her entire life will swing. After the supper disperses, you trail Anne into a quieter room where she retrieves a wooden box filled with carved figures. Knights, queens, horses, she moves them with delicate fingers, arranging them in neat lines. It's a childlike pastime, but you notice her placing certain pieces apart from the others. Grouping kings on one side, rebels on the other. You realize she's imitating what she's heard the adults discuss, trying to make sense of chaos with small wooden shapes. She hesitates over one figure, a queen carved in pale wood. For a long moment, Anne simply stares at it before setting it at the edge of the board. Half-shadowed, because even she knows that queens rarely stand in the center. A lesser-known detail emerges one evening as you stand beside her in the castle's small library. She pulls out a book on heraldry, flipping to a page about the symbol of the bear and ragged staff, Warwick's emblem. Some accounts mention that Anne once traced the symbol repeatedly in the margins of her books. Perhaps out of pride, or perhaps out of fear of disappointing the man behind it. Whether that's factual or just a romantic rumor passed along by later writers, historians still debate, but watching her fingertip hover over the inked drawing, you feel the truth. This emblem is both her identity and her anchor, even as it pulls her toward unknown depths. Outside the library, voices rise again. Warwick has declared himself ready to challenge Edward IV openly. Plans are unfolding, alliances are shifting, and you sense the world tilting more violently now. Anne closes the book, smoothing its cover with a slow exhale. It's as though she's bracing herself, because she knows, even without being told, that her father's decision will drag her into the heart of the conflict. And as you follow her back into the dim corridor, lit only by trembling candles, you realize you're stepping with her into a period where childhood ends not with a celebration, but with the sound of rising rebellion. You follow Anne through the corridors of Warwick Castle, but this time the air feels different, charged, heavy, as though every stone in the walls has learned a new tension. Because now, at last, the Kingmaker has made his move. And when he moves, the world moves with him. You can feel it in the sharp whispers that trail behind servants, in the quickened footsteps of knights buckling on armor, in the muted panic that tightens even the calmest faces. Anne walks through it all like a ghost drifting between thunderclaps. And you drift with her, feeling the weight of a decision she never made. The alliance Warwick seeks now is not one built on trust or affection, but on calculation. His rebellion against King Edward IV demands legitimacy, a claim powerful enough to rally the fractured loyalties of England. And so he turns toward the House of Lancaster, toward Margaret of Anjou, toward Prince Edward, the Prince of Wales, and by extension, toward Anne. You step into the council chamber where Warwick studies maps by lamplight. His shadow stretched long across the table like some looming creature with its claws sunk into England. Men argue around him in low, heated tones. Will Lancaster accept his proposal? Will the Queen trust him after years of enmity? Will this alliance actually hold, or collapse before it even begins? Anne watches from the corner. Silent, still, but no longer naive. She knows what these conversations mean. Even without hearing her name, she knows marriages in her world aren't forged by love, they're forged by power, necessity, and often desperation. And right now, Warwick is desperate. You hear the news ripple through the castle. Warwick intends to offer his daughter Anne Neville as bride to Edward of Lancaster, the only son of the deposed King Henry VI. The marriage would unite Lancaster with the Kingmaker's resources, a political earthquake so massive you can practically hear the walls vibrate with anticipation. Anne stands by a window when the confirmation finally reaches her. She doesn't cry or argue. She simply stares at the rain-smeared glass, her reflection faint and flickering. You step closer, sensing the quiet quake inside her. She's only 14, and already being positioned as the hinge on which England's future might swing. Meanwhile, at 14, you were probably trying to figure out which haircut looked least embarrassing, or maybe discovering the traumatic truth that algebra doesn't care about your feelings. A maid approaches, trying to speak softly, but even she can't hide her unease. Everyone knows Prince Edward's reputation. He is rumored to be fierce, intense, raised in the crucible of war and exile. Some say he's ruthless beyond his years. Others say he's brilliant, sharp, loyal to his mother, and some whisper things so contradictory that historians still debate which pieces belong to the real boy and which were political propaganda. Was he a budding tyrant, or simply a prince born into impossible circumstances? Truth is, no one truly agrees. But for Anne, rumors don't matter. Reality is coming for her. Fast. Preparations begin almost immediately. The castle bustles with tailors, scribes, and knights gathering supplies for the upcoming journey to France, where Margaret of Anjou has taken refuge. You watch Anne's attendants fold gowns into chests, pack books, wrap delicate items in cloth. Anne sits on a bench near the hearth, fingers knotted in her lap. The firelight warms her cheeks, but it doesn't soften her expression. She looks like someone bracing herself for a wave that can't be outrun. You step closer, sensing her thoughts swirl like the winter wind outside. She has never met Prince Edward. She has never seen the court of Margaret of Anjou. She doesn't know whether the future ahead of her will be a cage, a battlefield, or something stranger. All she knows is that she must go. Her father kneels before her that evening, adjusting her cloak with surprising gentleness. For a moment, you glimpse something human beneath the Kingmaker's armor: pride, fear, perhaps even guilt. Anne meets his gaze, searching for reassurance he can't quite offer. He tells her she will secure England's future. She says nothing, because what does a 14-year-old say to a father who is about to reshape her life entirely? The next morning, the castle stirs before sunrise. Hooves clatter on cobblestones as riders prepare for departure. Servants lug chests toward waiting wagons. The cold air stings your cheeks as you follow Anne through the archway, her breath forming small clouds with each exhale. The world feels vast and uncertain beyond the castle gate, a fitting match for the life she's about to step into. As the journey begins, you notice something subtle but telling. Anne sits straight-backed in the carriage, hands folded, gaze focused. She doesn't tremble, though you can see fear tucked neatly behind her composure. You admire her for that. Most people would be sobbing by now. You might have been Googling how to escape medieval political marriages within the first mile. Along the route, the countryside is soaked in autumn mist. Fields stretch like pale parchment under the pale morning light. Waterfowl drift along quiet streams. But the peace of the landscape only contrasts the turbulence inside the party. Knights ride with hands near their swords. Messengers come and go. Even the horses seem tense, as if they can sense the political weight of the journey. One night, while camped beneath the twisted branches of an old oak, Anne steps aside from the group. You follow her to the edge of the campfire's glow. She looks up at the stars, cold, distant, unblinking. She whispers something so faint you almost miss it. "I hope I am enough." The words are not self-pitying. They are resigned, quiet, brave in a way that startles you. A lesser-known detail emerges along the journey. Anne kept a small piece of embroidered cloth tucked inside her sleeve. Stitched with the bear and ragged staff, the symbol of Warwick. Some believe it was a token of courage, something familiar to steady her. Others argue she carried it because she feared losing her identity among strangers. Historians still debate its meaning, but watching her fingers gently brush the fabric, you sense it matters to her more than she can articulate. Finally, you reach the coast. Ships wait in the harbor, their sails rippling like ghostly banners in the wind. Anne hesitates for the briefest second before boarding, taking in the vast gray sea and the unknown future waiting across it. When she steps onto the deck, you feel the moment like a soft break in the world. This is the step that seals her fate. This is the moment where the alliance becomes more than strategy. It becomes her life. As the ship pulls away from the shore, Warwick's figure shrinks into the distance, leaving Anne with nothing but the steady roll of waves and the cold certainty of the path ahead. You stay with her at the railing, the wind catching her hair, the salt stinging your eyes. And for a long time, neither of you speak, because sometimes the most important moments aren't loud, they're quiet, heavy, inevitable. And this marriage, this alliance born not from affection but from political desperation, is about to cast Anne Neville deeper into the shadows than ever before. The sea wind bites at your cheeks as the ship carries you and Anne toward the French coast. Its wooden hull groaning softly in the swell. Anne stands near the railing, fingers curled around the salt-dampened wood, her cloak snapping in the gusts. You stay close, watching the horizon shift from deep midnight blue to a bruised gray. Every mile traveled pulls her further from the childhood she barely had, and closer to a destiny she had absolutely no say in. The ocean doesn't care, of course. It just keeps rolling, as indifferent as history itself. The voyage is long, filled with cramped quarters, lurching decks, and meals that make you question medieval culinary judgment. At one point Anne tastes the ship's pottage, presses her lips together, and quietly decides that hunger is preferable. You sympathize. You once ordered seafood on discount, same energy, same regret. As France approaches, the mood of the travelers shifts. Conversations grow more clipped, faces tighten. Anne senses the tension and mirrors it, her expression smoothing into careful neutrality. She knows who awaits her on the other side of the crossing: Margaret of Anjou. A queen forged in exile and battle, and Prince Edward, the young man who will soon be her husband whether she likes it or not. When the ship finally creaks into the harbor, a cold mist hangs low over the water. French soldiers stand waiting, their armor glinting dully in the muted light. You watch Anne descend the gangplank with a steady step, though her heartbeat feels like it echoes through you, fast, uncertain, fluttering like wings pressed between pages of a closed book. Margaret of Anjou arrives moments later, flanked by guards and attendants. Her presence fills the space like a storm front rolling in. She is regal, severe, her eyes sharp enough to cut stone. You suddenly understand why even hardened commanders fear her. She studies Anne for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Anne bows deeply. You bow too, though you're fairly sure your posture would earn you a medieval etiquette citation. Margaret moves closer, lifting Anne's chin slightly with gloved fingertips. There is something appraising in her gaze, something that wonders whether this young, quiet girl can play a part in reclaiming a kingdom. Finally, she nods, approval, acceptance, and just like that, the alliance becomes real. You're escorted into the chateau where the meeting will take place. Tapestries of hunting scenes line the walls, and the scent of burning resin curls through the halls. Servants hurry past, murmuring in French. Anne walks beside Margaret, the queen's presence imposing but strangely protective. You sense Anne slowly understanding that she has not stepped into safety, just into a different kind of power. Prince Edward enters the hall later. Tall for his age, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, there is intensity in him, the kind that accretes in boys raised amid war councils instead of childhood games. He bows formally to Anne, who lowers her eyes in practiced grace. Their first exchange is polite, almost stiff. You notice Edward trying to read her, as though searching for steel beneath her calm exterior. Whether he finds it, you can't tell. Anne, for her part, studies him with quiet curiosity, but not fear. Rumors about Edward swirl through the hall like restless ghosts. Some Lancastrian loyalists call him brilliant. Some Yorkist enemies claim he delights in violence. Historians still argue endlessly about which version is true. But what you see here is something more complicated, a young man shaped by exile, desperation, and the crushing weight of being a symbol long before he was allowed to be a person. A lesser-known detail surfaces as you follow Anne through the chateau gardens later that evening. It's said she once admired the climbing roses growing along the stone walls, roses the color of deep wine. She traced the petals lightly, her face softening for the first time since arriving in France. Whether this moment is recorded fact or one of those small tales that drifted through later retellings, historians still debate, but standing beside her now, you can imagine it vividly. A quiet girl finding a flicker of beauty during a time defined mostly by fear and duty. The betrothal arrangements unfold quickly. Margaret speaks firmly, outlining the terms. Warwick nods gravely. Anne sits beside them, composed but inwardly trembling. You feel her pulse quicken as the future narrows into a single path. A marriage meant to rebuild the Lancastrian cause. She glances at Edward once, And in that brief moment something passes between them. Not affection, not yet, but recognition. Two young people, both shaped by the ambitions of parents. Both bound by something bigger than themselves. The formal betrothal ceremony takes place the next morning. Sunlight filters in through stained glass, casting red and blue pools of color across the floor. Anne's voice is barely above a whisper as she repeats the vows. But steady. Edward's tone is stronger, but not unkind. When it ends, Anne's shoulders relax in a small exhale, as if she has survived the first test of a long, uncertain road. Celebrations follow, a small feast with modest music. Laughter echoing through the hall like a fragile attempt at normalcy. Servants rush about with platters of roasted meat and spiced wine. Anne sits beside Edward, answering his questions in quiet phrases. You notice he leans slightly toward her when she speaks. Curious, perhaps even respectful. It's a small sign, but enough to make you wonder whether this alliance might hold more than the cold practicality that birthed it. But outside these walls, danger looms. Edward IV has regained strength in England. Yorkist forces gather like tightening storm clouds. And everyone in this French chateau knows that the marriage is not an end. It's the beginning of a march back into war. Late that night, Anne cannot sleep. She stands on the balcony overlooking the moonlit courtyard. Cloak fluttering softly. You join her, hearing the distant murmur of the sea. She rests her hands on the stone railing and whispers, I hope this matters. I hope it means something. Her uncertainty is palpable, but her resolve is stronger. Because tomorrow, she will return to England as the Princess of Wales, a title that carries more danger than glory. And the triumph her father imagines will become, for her, the next shadow stretching across her already shadowed life. The journey back to England begins in a hush, as though the entire French coast is holding its breath. You and Anne stand on the deck of the ship just before dawn. The sky a pale wash of silver blue. The waves lap against the hull with a steady rhythm that almost feels like a warning, soft, persistent, unignorable. Anne clutches the railing, her new identity resting uneasily on her shoulders, Princess of Wales. It sounds grand, glorious even, but you can feel the weight of it pressing down on her spine like a stone. The crew bustles around you, adjusting ropes, checking sails. Edward of Lancaster stands a few paces away, speaking quietly with his mother, Margaret of Anjou. His expression is set, determined, sharp-edged, unyielding. Anne watches them for a moment, her face unreadable. There is distance between her and her new husband still. A space filled with unanswered questions and unspoken obligations. You sense she's trying to understand him. This boy who seems older than his years. As if each battle lost, each exile endured, aged him twice over. As the ship pushes off from the harbor, you feel Anne's breath catch. Not fear, something else. A subtle shift, a tightening. The moment where she finally accepts that the life she once knew is gone. Ahead lies England, fractured, angry, restless, a country ready to be reshaped. And she is expected to be part of the hands doing the reshaping. The voyage is rougher this time. Storms roll across the water in jagged gray smears. Anne spends hours sitting quietly in her cabin, listening to the wood creak and the waves crash. You sit beside her, catching glimpses of her thoughts as they pass across her face. worry for the uncertain welcome awaiting her, curiosity about Edward, fear for what war might demand of her. Once, during a particularly violent swell, she whispers, "I do not know what kind of life I am supposed to build." You don't answer. You can't. You're not even sure history itself knows. But amid the storms, a small, surprising thing happens. Edward seeks her out. He asks if she is comfortable, if she needs extra blankets, if she gets seasick. His tone is formal, yes, but sincere. He tells her about England as he remembers it, castles, forests, festivals long gone. He speaks not like a prince demanding loyalty, but like a young man reaching for a connection that might steady him. And though Anne doesn't smile, her shoulders loosen, just slightly. There is something unexpectedly gentle in Edward's voice, a contrast to the fierce reputation that's followed him across Europe. Historians still debate what he was truly like, whether he was cruel, passionate, clever, reckless. But here, on this storm-tossed ship, you witness a moment that feels simple and human. Two teenagers trying to bridge the gulf of a political marriage. When England's cliffs finally appear, pale against the dark water, a ripple of tension spreads through everyone aboard. Soldiers tighten their grips on their weapons. Margaret stands rigid, her gaze fixed like an arrow on the coastline. Anne swallows hard, her breath shallow. The wind carries the chill of English autumn, and it feels sharper than it should. The landing is swift but cautious. Lancaster loyalists greet the returning royals with cheers. Though their numbers are smaller than expected, many had hoped Warwick's rebellion would have already turned the tide. But news has reached them. News that makes your stomach twist. Edward IV has crushed Warwick's initial uprising. The kingmaker has fled. And worst of all, Anne's sister, Isabel, is now pulled into a widening chasm between her father and her husband, George of Clarence. Families fracturing under political pressure. It's almost medieval standard procedure. But it hits Anne differently. You see her jaw tighten. That is her sister, her only sister. And the war is cleaving their lives apart before Anne even sets foot on English soil. Still, the Lancastrian party pushes forward. Towns open their gates hesitantly as Anne and Edward pass through, reclaiming support piece by piece. Anne rides beside Margaret at times, the Queen's fierce presence almost like armor. At other times she rides beside Edward, the two of them speaking quietly under their cloaks. Edward explains battle tactics, political strategies, how the Yorkist support fractured after Warwick's defection. Anne listens, absorbing everything, her mind sharper than anyone expects from a girl her age. One evening, while camped near a small hamlet, Anne walks alone to the edge of the encampment. Fog curls across the field, softening the flicker of distant lanterns. She kneels in the damp grass, fingertips brushing the earth. "I wonder," she murmurs, "if peace ever truly existed, or if it is only an idea people chase across lifetimes." It's a heavy thought for a 15-year-old. But then, you remember who she is. The daughter of the kingmaker. The wife of a prince born in war. A girl whose life has always been shaped by forces beyond her reach. A lesser-known detail emerges as she stands. Anne carries a small piece of chalk tucked into her pocket. Some obscure accounts claim she used to draw tiny symbols on stones or tent poles, circles, crosses, floral patterns. not for magic or superstition, but to give herself a moment of control in a world where she had none. Whether this is fact or rumor, historians still debate, but as you watch her trace a tiny mark onto a smooth stone, the gesture feels real, grounding, gentle. As the Lancastrian forces gather strength, Anne becomes more visible. People who once saw her only as Warwick's daughter now see her as part of the rightful royal line, or so they believe. She meets nobles, speaks when spoken to, rides with dignity. She's learning, fast, learning how to be a symbolic figure, learning how to be watched. And she's learning that being visible doesn't mean being powerful. Not yet. Then comes the day that will shatter everything. Tewkesbury. You feel a shift in the air weeks before the battle. Like the tightening of a drumskin. Anne feels it too. She watches the soldiers train. Her expression drawn and tense. She listens to the commanders argue over routes and supplies. She stands beside Edward as he dons his armor, her hands trembling as she assists with the buckles. You want to tell her everything will be okay. That battles sometimes end cleanly. That heroes triumph. But battles rarely work that way. And history is rarely kind. As the Lancastrian army marches toward Tewkesbury, you sense something terrible building. A silent pressure that tightens with every beat of Anne's heart. The world around her seems to grow still. Even the birds fall quiet. Because what awaits her on that battlefield will change everything. You feel the tension long before dawn breaks, a cold, metallic weight hanging in the air as the Lancastrian camp stirs. Today is the day. Tewkesbury. The name feels sharp on your tongue. A word shaped like a blade. Anne stands outside her tent, cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The early morning fog curling around her feet like pale smoke. She watches soldiers prepare, tightening straps, checking sword edges, whispering quick prayers no one admits to saying. Even the horses seem uneasy, stamping the ground as if trying to warn their riders to turn back. Anne's gaze drifts to Edward of Lancaster. He moves with a seriousness far beyond his 17 years, issuing orders in a clipped, steady voice. His armor gleams faintly in the gray half-light, and for a moment you see what the Lancastrians see, a prince shaped by hardship, ready to reclaim what he believes is rightfully his. But beneath that polished confidence is something else. Fear carefully tucked behind resolve. You catch it only because Anne catches it. She studies him with an expression that's not quite affection and not quite distance, something in between. A fragile respect built on shared uncertainty. Margaret of Anjou stands nearby, fierce and tense, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whiten. She has fought too long, lost too much, endured too many exiles to falter now. She gives Anne a nod, firm but almost maternal, as if trying to lend her strength. Anne returns the gesture, though her breath trembles slightly. Soon the army begins to move. Drums echo across the fields, each beat a reminder that this is real, irreversible. You walk beside Anne as she mounts her horse, the leather creaking softly beneath her. She is not riding into battle. No one would permit that, but she will remain close. Close enough to feel the tremors of the clash. Close enough to hear the screams carried on the wind. Close enough to lose everything. The path to Tewkesbury winds through rolling fields dotted with spring blossoms. An almost cruel contrast to the violence gathering on the horizon. Birds flutter out of hedgerows as the army passes. A light breeze stirs the grass. If you didn't know what awaited, you might think this was simply a peaceful countryside morning. But Anne knows. You feel it in the way she clutches the reins. Every rhythm of her heartbeat seems to echo in your chest. When the Lancastrian forces finally reach Tewkesbury, the Yorkist army is already waiting. Their banners snap in the wind, white roses gleaming bright. The sight hits you like a strike to the ribs. Anne inhales sharply, her pulse skittering. She scans the enemy lines, searching for familiar faces she hopes not to see, because the Yorkists include not only enemies, but former allies, former family friends, and men who once shared wine with her father in Warwick Castle's great hall. The armies position themselves. Commands ring out. Shields lock into place. You hear the crackling tension of two sides poised at the brink. Anne remains near a small rise behind the Lancastrian lines, surrounded by attendants and guards. From here she can see everything: the formations, the glint of sunlight on steel, the shifting of ranks. Edward rides ahead with his commanders, his red dragon banner whipping ferociously in the wind. Then, with a roar that seems to split the morning open, the battle begins. You flinch as the first clash reverberates across the field, a violent crash of metal against metal. Shields splintering, voices rising in a feral chorus. Anne grabs the saddle's pommel, knuckles whitening. Her horse prances nervously beneath her. Sensing the chaos ahead, soldiers rush forward, disappearing into clouds of dust and smoke. Arrows arc through the sky like dark streaks of rain. The noise is overwhelming. It's not a cinematic symphony, it's raw, uneven, terrifying. People scream, armor grinds. The ground shakes beneath the weight of hundreds of bodies colliding. It's the kind of sound that burrows into your bones and stays there. Anne tries to track Edward's banner through the haze, her eyes wide and full of silent pleading. She's not crying, she's long past tears, but you can feel the fear radiating from her like heat. She whispers something under her breath, barely audible. Let him be safe. Whether she means Edward, or her father's cause, or simply the people she loves, you can't be sure. Time blurs. The fighting intensifies. Lancastrian forces push forward, then falter. Word spreads that part of the line is breaking. Officers shout, trying to regain control. You watch panic ripple through the ranks like cracks in glass. Anne leans forward, trying to catch glimpses of the leaders. Her breath comes quick and shallow. Then a messenger rides up, face ashen. The prince has pressed too far, he's cut off. Anne's breath stops. The world seems to tilt. You feel it with her, a cold spike of dread that makes your stomach twist. Margaret closes her eyes briefly, gripping the horse's mane as if holding on to the last thread of hope. You want to run toward the battlefield, even though you know you can't, even though you know she can't. All you can do is watch as chaos swallows the field. Minutes stretch into eternities. Then comes the moment that will carve itself into Anne's soul forever. A second messenger appears, his helm missing, blood streaked across his cheek. He's shaking so badly he can barely form words. When he finally speaks, his voice cracks. The prince is down. Anne goes utterly still. All movement drains from her. The world becomes painfully quiet for one suspended heartbeat. You feel her mind reject the words. her heart clawing for any possible alternative. A gust of wind lifts the edge of her cloak. But she doesn't move. Then he adds the words no one wants to hear. The prince is dead. It crashes over her like a tidal wave. Though she doesn't scream, doesn't collapse. She simply inhales a breath so sharp it feels like it cuts through you too. The shock freezes her in place. Her eyes unfocus, as if the field before her has dissolved into something unrecognizable. Historians still debate the exact circumstances of Edward's death, whether he died fighting bravely, whether he was captured and executed, whether someone gave the final order in cold blood. The accounts are tangled in politics, bias, and grief. But for Anne, none of that matters. All she knows is that the husband she barely had time to know is gone. The future she was told to build has shattered. The alliance her father forged has collapsed into dust and blood. Margaret cries out then, a howl of maternal anguish that rips through the fields like a storm tearing through branches. It makes Anne flinch, but she doesn't move. Her world has gone very quiet inside itself. Lancastrian forces crumble soon after. Defeat sweeps across the battlefield. Anne's future fractures with it. You stay beside her as she closes her eyes at last. Trembling, her breath a thin thread. She whispers something you barely hear. I was not enough. But the truth is more brutal and more simple. No one could have been. Not against the tidal force of history. Not on a battlefield like Tewkesbury. And not in a life that was never shaped by her choices. The battlefield smoke hasn't even cleared when the world closes in on Anne. Tewkesbury is behind you now. But its echoes follow like a shadow that refuses to fall away. The Lancastrian army lies broken. Margaret of Anjou has been captured. The red dragon banners hang limp, trampled in mud, and Anne, quiet, hollow-eyed Anne, rides under guard. No longer a princess, no longer a political promise, but a valuable captive whose future depends entirely on the mercy of the victorious Yorkists. You walk beside her through the ruins of the Lancastrian camp. Abandoned tents flap mournfully in the wind. Cookfires smolder unattended. Pieces of armor lie half buried in churned earth. Anne keeps her gaze fixed forward. Jaw tight, hands clenched in her lap as her horse moves through the devastation. She does not look toward the fields where bodies still lie. She cannot. You feel her resisting the urge to crumble, holding herself together with sheer instinct. Her grief is not gone, it's folded inward, tucked into a place so deep that nothing can touch it yet. A Yorkist commander rides up, giving her a stiff glance. His voice is pointed, but not unkind. You'll be taken to Richard of Gloucester's protection. The words settle heavily in the air. Protection, a convenient word that in medieval politics could mean anything from kindness to captivity. Anne's breath hitches, eyes flickering with recognition. Richard, the youngest brother of King Edward IV. She met him only once as a child. In Yorkist halls filled with tension and polite smiles. The memory is faint. A boy with sharp eyes and a quiet manner. The contrast with his loud, charismatic brothers had been almost amusing. Now she has no idea what awaits her. The journey toward Yorkist territory is slow and heavily guarded. Anne rides between two soldiers. The iron clink of their armor forming a rhythm too steady, too inescapable. You feel the old life collapsing behind you like burned timber. Everything she had been preparing for, her role as Princess of Wales, the alliance with Lancaster, even the thin thread of understanding she had begun forming with Edward, all of it reduced to ash. During a brief rest, Anne dismounts and walks toward a small brook. Its water cold and clear. She kneels and rinses her hands, though they are not dirty. It takes you a moment to understand. She's trying to steady herself. Trying to reclaim something, anything, she can control. Her reflection ripples, distorted. She watches it for a long time. Her expression unreadable. A lesser-known detail stirs in your memory. Some accounts suggest Anne kept a single silver button from Edward's discarded cloak, hidden in the folds of her gown. Not out of romance, there had been little time for that, but out of sorrow and respect for a boy whose life had been swallowed by war. Whether this is fact or invention, historians still debate, but as she touches her sleeve now, you wonder if she's seeking its comforting weight. As the party approaches Coventry, the landscape shifts. The city walls rise from the earth like a massive stone spine. Imposing and gray, the air smells of smoke and tannery vats. Merchants and townsfolk line the roads, eager to catch a glimpse of the defeated Lancastrian figures. Some point, some whisper, some laugh nervously, unsure whether pity or satisfaction is the appropriate reaction. Anne keeps her gaze lowered. You feel every whispered word sting her, even though she pretends not to hear. It's not humiliation she fears, it's invisibility. The sense that she has become nothing more than a symbol for the winning side to display. Then, one morning, Richard of Gloucester arrives. He rides into the courtyard with a quiet authority that surprises you. No bluster, no dramatic flourish. His presence is sharp but controlled, like a blade sheathed in velvet. He speaks briefly with the commander, then turns toward Anne. She meets his eyes cautiously, bracing for judgment or condescension. But instead, something unexpected happens. Richard inclines his head, deeply, respectfully, more respectfully than a Yorkist prince should bow to the daughter of a defeated enemy. "Lady Anne," he says softly, "you are safe now." Safe. The word hangs subtly wrong, but Richard's tone is sincere. Anne nods, a tiny gesture that betrays neither acceptance nor disbelief. You feel her studying him carefully, searching for cracks in his composure. Richard offers his hand to help her down from her horse. She hesitates only a heartbeat before accepting. His grip is steady, warm, grounding. When her feet touch the ground, she sways slightly, exhaustion finally catching up. Richard's hand lightly steadies her elbow, then falls away. He gives no speech, no gloating, no reminder of her political insignificance. Instead, he says, "You must be weary. You will have chambers prepared at once." You can see Anne's mind working. Why is he being kind? What does he want? No kindness in her world comes without purpose. No gesture is free. Over the next few days, Anne remains under Richard's supervision, though the word supervision feels too harsh for what it becomes. He checks on her, ensures her meals are delivered, speaks to her not as a trophy or a captive, but as someone whose suffering he genuinely sees. One evening, he finds her in the courtyard, standing beneath an archway where ivy trails in soft green loops. She's tracing the pattern of a stone carving with one fingertip, Lost in her thoughts, Richard approaches, stops a respectful distance away, and simply says, "I'm sorry for your loss." The words knock the breath from her in a way nothing else has. No one has said it aloud. No one has acknowledged her grief, her pain, her shattered future. She meets his gaze, startled, vulnerable, the first crack in her composure showing. Her voice is quiet, steady, but filled with aching honesty. He was barely a stranger. But he died because of what others decided. And I could do nothing. Richard's expression shifts, not pity, not superiority, but a deep, empathetic understanding. Power often demands much from those who never asked for it. His words linger. It's here that something truly unexpected happens, not romance. Not anything so swift or dramatic. Just a small, fragile thread of trust. A thread that will weave itself into the future in ways neither Anne nor you can yet imagine. Because Richard of Gloucester is about to become far more than the man who rescued Anne from political captivity. He will become her husband, her protector, her companion in a world where every alliance is a gamble. But for now, as she stands beside him in the fading light, Anne is simply a girl recovering from the ruins of her life, clinging to the first kindness she's been offered in far too long. And for the first time since Tewkesbury, she breathes without feeling like the world is collapsing around her. The days that follow feel strangely suspended, quiet, hushed, almost like the world itself is pausing to catch its breath after the brutality of Tewkesbury. You walk beside Anne through stone corridors softened by tapestries, past windows where the afternoon light spills like warm honey. Her steps are small but steady. She moves carefully, as though learning her own weight again, for the first time in what feels like forever. No one is giving her orders. No one is shoving her toward a destiny she didn't choose. She is still confined, yes, but not crushed. Richard of Gloucester remains a steady presence, appearing not with the abrupt power of a prince, but with the quiet consistency of someone who understands grief more deeply than he knows how to say. You notice how he always approaches Anne at her pace, never rushing her, never crowding her. The contrast with the intensity of Margaret, the fire of Edward, the ambition of Warwick is stark. One afternoon, Anne sits in a small garden enclosed by walls draped in late spring ivy. The air is thick with the scent of rosemary and damp stone. She traces the edge of a leaf, her thoughts drifting like the clouds overhead. Richard steps through the archway and pauses, giving her space to acknowledge him. When she lifts her gaze, he bows his head in greeting. "Lady Anne," he says softly, "I hope the quiet here is a comfort." "It is," she replies, "more than I expected. You can hear the unspoken truth, more than she's been allowed in years." He sits on a stone bench nearby, not beside her, but close enough to speak without raising his voice. It's a considerate distance, an offering of both presence and privacy. You sense Anne appreciating it more than she lets on. Richard asks if she wishes for a walk. Anne hesitates, then nods, and so the two of you walk with him through the small paths. Gravel crunching lightly beneath your feet. He speaks of ordinary things, seasonal harvests, his brother Clarence's unpredictable moods, a book he read recently that he thought she might like. These aren't political conversations, they're human ones, and they allow Anne's guarded heart to unclench. Bit by bit. A rarely mentioned detail surfaces in this time. Some chroniclers claim Anne had a quiet sense of humor when she felt safe. A dry wit inherited perhaps from her mother. Whether that's true or not, you begin to see glimpses of it. One afternoon, Richard tries to identify a plant growing near the garden wall and confidently calls it something completely wrong. Anne's lips twitch in amusement, and she gently corrects him. He laughs, an honest, warm sound. It's brief, but it lingers in the air like sunlight cutting through gloom. Even the servants notice. Whispers trail behind Anne in the hallways, not mocking, not fearful, but surprised. She looks stronger. One murmurs, "The girl's spirit isn't broken after all." Another adds, "The Duke treats her kindly." Then, with a nervous glance around, "Kinder than most would." But this fragile piece can't hide the political truth pressing in from outside the walls. Anne is valuable, too valuable. She is the heiress to massive Neville estates, lands that both the crown and her brother-in-law Clarence covet. And Clarence, ambitious, temperamental, and rarely reasonable, wants control of her inheritance. He already has Isabel, Anne's older sister. If he also had Anne, he'd monopolize the entire Neville legacy. So Clarence does exactly what you fear. He hides her. Literally hides her. Why? To prevent Richard from acting first. You feel the shock alongside her when soldiers arrive one morning. Not to escort her gently, but to relocate her abruptly under Clarence's orders. He claims it's for her protection. Everyone knows it's for his advantage. One moment she's in a garden, taking tentative steps toward healing. The next she's confined again, this time in a house under Clarence's control. It's not a dungeon, but it might as well be. She's kept away from influence, away from Richard, away from the world. She is watched constantly. Her requests are ignored. Her grief, her needs, her rights, none of them matter to Clarence. You see Anne withdrawing again, pressing her emotions deep into the quiet places of her mind. Her eyes grow distant. She speaks less. The walls feel closer, heavier. As the days pass, even servants seem uneasy, avoiding her gaze as though afraid of being seen in a moment of sympathy. But Richard does not forget her. He moves quietly, carefully, setting diplomatic wheels in motion, while Clarence tries to smother Anne's future for the sake of inheritance. Richard works to free her, not for land, not for power, but because he believes she deserves a choice. You can sense the difference in the motivations swirling around her. For once, someone is protecting her not as a pawn, but as a person. Yet, historians still debate Richard's motives. Was it empathy? Was it political calculation? Was it something more personal? The truth, as with so much in history, is probably a blend of reasons. But you know what Anne felt? Relief when she heard his name whispered by sympathetic voices. Relief that someone out there saw her suffering. One evening, while locked in Clarence's custody, Anne finds a sliver of moonlight cutting through the shutters and kneels before it. You feel her breath tremble, her whispered words barely audible. "Please, let this not be the end of me." She is not praying for triumph. She is praying for freedom. And it arrives, quietly, unexpectedly, when Richard finally confronts Clarence. You don't witness the argument, but the tension in the house afterward is unmistakable. Clarence fumes, servants whisper, doors slam. Then, like something pulled loose from a tightened snare. Anne is freed into Richard's custody. When they meet again, it's not dramatic. It's small, gentle, almost achingly human. Richard bows once more, eyes softened. Anne lifts her head, one careful inch at a time, and meets his gaze. For a moment, the world stills, the kind of quiet where things begin rather than end. Little does she know that this quiet moment will lead to the next great turning point of her life. A marriage. Not one forced by fear. Not one designed to salvage a collapsing cause. But one that, in its own way, might finally offer her something she has never truly had. A choice. You can feel the shift before Anne does, a soft, nearly imperceptible change in the way people speak her name. The way footsteps echo in the corridors. The way Richard of Gloucester moves through the halls with new purpose. Something is building, quiet but steady, like a tide rising at night, and you sense Anne standing on the shoreline of her own life, unsure whether the water will lift her or swallow her whole. Richard's intervention has freed her from Clarence's suffocating grasp. But freedom in the late 1400s is never absolute, especially for a young woman with one of the largest inheritances in England tied invisibly around her wrists. You walk beside her as she follows Richard through the modest manor house where she has been transferred. Each step lighter than the last. She looks around with cautious curiosity, as if testing whether this place will allow her to breathe. Richard pauses near the hearth, gestures gently for her to sit, and speaks in a quiet tone that feels entirely different from the political brutality she's grown used to. "You have been held against your will," he says. "That ends now." Anne exhales, a small, shaky release, like a knot loosening in her chest. She's too careful to show gratitude openly, too used to being watched for any sign of weakness. But you see it anyway. A flicker, a softening, a brief moment where light returns to her eyes. Over the following days, Richard arranges for her comfort, new gowns, access to the garden, attendants who actually listen when she speaks. He checks on her at measured intervals. His presence always calm, always respectful. If he notices her lingering grief, her quiet hesitation, her uncertainty, he never pushes. He simply exists nearby, steady as a pillar. And Anne begins, slowly, to reclaim pieces of herself. One afternoon, you find her alone in a sunlit chamber, running her fingertips along the spines of books arranged carefully on a shelf. When she pulls one down, an illuminated herbal with watercolor leaves, her expression softens. The sunlight glints off her hair, and for just a moment, she looks like the girl she might have been in a world without war. Richard appears in the doorway. He doesn't intrude, he just asks, "Which one did you choose?" She hesitates before answering, as though unused to being addressed with simple curiosity instead of expectation. "The one with colors," she says quietly. He smiles, a small, private smile. "It was always my favorite as a boy." It's such an ordinary exchange that you almost miss how extraordinary it is for her. For Anne, who has lived years without gentleness, the simplicity is a balm. But outside these walls, the political machinery grinds on. Clarence is furious enough to vent to anyone who will listen about how Richard is stealing Anne for his own advantage. He demands her return. He presses the king, his brother Edward, for support. He fumes that the Neville estates should be his by right of his marriage to Isabel. This tension trickles back to Anne in half-whispered fragments. She hears the servants murmuring. She sees Richard's expression tighten after long meetings. She understands more than anyone thinks she does. And she knows one truth with chilling clarity. Her future will be decided not by who cares for her, but by who wins the legal and political struggle over her existence. And Richard knows it too. One evening, he requests an audience with Anne. You accompany her to the dimly lit chamber where he waits. Hands clasped behind his back. Expression composed but earnest. Lady Anne, he begins, I wish to speak frankly, with respect, and only with your consent. She nods slowly, her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. You are not safe without a formal position, he says. Clarence will continue to pursue you, not for who you are, but for what you represent. If you remain unprotected, he will fight to return you to his custody. And the king, he hesitates, weighing his words thoughtfully. The king will not intervene strongly enough to stop him. Anne feels the truth in every syllable. You feel it too, a cold, creeping reality. Then Richard continues, his voice low, sincere, unmistakably gentle. I wish to marry you. The words do not hang in the air dramatically. They settle, steady and calm, like stones placed carefully in a foundation. Anne's breath stutters, her fingers curl in her lap. Richard does not move closer. He does not press. He simply adds, I do not ask this for your inheritance. I ask because I believe I can protect you, and because I believe we understand one another. But the choice must be yours. You sense her mind racing. Marriage, again, another political union, another step she didn't plan. But this time, something is different. This time, she is being asked. Not ordered, not traded, not bartered. Asked. It's a small mercy by modern standards. But in her world, it feels monumental. Anne studies him carefully, his solemn face, his steady eyes, his respectful distance. She remembers Clarence's cruelty, Edward of Lancaster's intensity, Warwick's ambition. She compares all of that to this quiet, thoughtful man in front of her. She imagines a marriage shaped not by fire, but by something almost unthinkable for her life, calm. And slowly, very slowly, she nods. Yes, she whispers, I accept. The tension in Richard's shoulders softens. He bows his head, deeply, reverently, as though receiving an honor rather than a political advantage. Within days, arrangements begin. Even Clarence cannot halt them. The king approves the union, perhaps relieved to settle the dispute between his brothers without open conflict. And though Edward IV's motivations may be political, something warmer underpins Anne's decision. The wedding itself is small, nothing like the grand ceremonies you see in period dramas. Just a handful of witnesses, a priest murmuring Latin, sunlight filtering through narrow windows. Anne stands beside Richard, calm and composed. When they exchange vows, you notice something subtle but profound. They look directly into each other's eyes. And for Anne, for quiet, shadowed Anne, it is the first marriage in which she feels seen. Afterward, Richard escorts her out into the courtyard, where a cool breeze moves through the arches. She feels lighter, steadier, anchored in a way she has never known. A lesser-known detail surfaces here. Some accounts say Richard placed a sprig of rosemary in her hands after the ceremony, a symbol of remembrance. Whether this is bridal tradition or personal gesture, historians still debate, but in this moment, it feels intimate, almost tender. Anne holds the sprig gently, the fragrant leaves brushing her palm, and she whispers, "Thank you." Not for the marriage itself, but for the choice. For seeing her as a person, not a pawn. But the shadows of the tower still linger, because England is changing. Whispers swirl through the kingdom. 2 young princes soon vanish behind its walls. And the world will look at Anne and Richard with suspicion, curiosity, fear. You can feel it forming even now. Even in this moment of quiet. The infamous mystery of the princes in the tower is coming for them. About to reshape the narrative. About to darken the edges of Anne's life once again. You step into Anne's new life with Richard slowly. Like easing through the doorway of a dim room where the light softens instead of stains. Marriage does not transform her world in a sudden blaze of warmth. Nothing in Anne's life ever has. But it reshapes the edges. Where there was once tension, there is steadiness. Where there was fear, there is caution tempered by calm. You feel it every time she walks beside Richard through the stone corridors of Middleham Castle. Every time she lifts her gaze without flinching. Every time she allows the smallest piece of hope into her chest. Middleham becomes her refuge, not a grand palace glittering with jewels and tapestries, but a fortress with wide courtyards, wind-carved towers, and rooms warmed by thick woolen hangings. Richard knows its rhythms intimately. He grew up here, and he shares them with Anne gently. As though offering her the familiar comforts of his own childhood. You watch her breathe in the smell of hay from the stables. Hear the distant clatter of wooden practice swords. Feel the draft slipping under old oak doors. Somehow, all of it feels safer than anywhere she has lived before. The household adjusts around her presence. Servants, once wary of the defeated Lancastrian princess, begin to soften. They bring her pastries still warm from the oven, flowers plucked from the kitchen garden, small tokens of welcome that Anne receives with quiet gratitude. You notice how she thanks each person by name, how she listens when they speak, how she moves through the halls with humility rather than entitlement. It doesn't erase the sorrow inside her. Nothing could. But it gives her room to breathe beside it. Richard is never far. He watches over her without suffocating her. He speaks to her with sincerity instead of strategy. You see him studying her sometimes, as though mapping the delicate terrain of her emotions with careful steps. And Anne, whose whole life has been shaped by men who made decisions for her, begins to trust the man who chooses to walk with her. Together, they find a rhythm. They speak in low tones during evening walks. They read together in the solar. The quiet between them comfortable rather than tense. Sometimes Richard makes a dry remark about court politics. And Anne's lips twitch with the smallest ghost of a smile. Her subtle sense of humor briefly flickering to life. It's a warmth few would ever see. Hidden behind her composed exterior like a candle glowing behind frosted glass. But even in this gentler world, whispers seep through the stone walls. Edward IV falls gravely ill. The succession becomes uncertain. And Anne watches Richard shift subtly. Like a man bracing himself against an approaching storm. When the king recovers, briefly, The kingdom exhales, but the clouds never truly part. Court politics swell like restless tidewater, pulling Anne and Richard back toward London. Back toward uncertainty. Back toward the center of a storm they never asked to weather. And then, everything changes. King Edward IV dies. News arrives in a burst of frantic footsteps and hurried whispers. Anne feels the castle tighten around her, as though the very stones are trying to brace themselves. Richard stands motionless at first, absorbing the weight of the news. Edward's sons, young Edward and even younger Richard, are the heirs. But they are children, vulnerable, surrounded by ambitious advisors with questionable loyalties. You sense the tension building in Richard, a sense of duty, of protectiveness, of suspicion, and Anne feels it too. She knows how power shifts when a throne is left temporarily unguarded. She has lived her whole life watching adults claw for influence over crowns. She knows enough to be afraid. And then the whispers begin. Faint at first, then sharper, louder. The Woodvilles are maneuvering. The elder prince is being prepared for coronation. Richard is needed in London to protect the boy king. Anne knows what this means. Her husband must step forward. He must act. He must confront a court filled with people who resent him, fear him, or seek to outmaneuver him. As they travel south, you watch Anne study the landscape rolling past, the fields, the hedgerows, the villages. Her hands tremble only once. When the wind shifts and she catches the distant scent of smoke from a peasant's hearth. It reminds her of childhood, of Warwick Castle, of the long chain of events that dragged her to this precipice. But she steadies herself. She has learned how to live inside shadows, how to move silently, observe sharply, endure quietly. When they reach London, the city is buzzing like a hive kicked open. Rumors spiral through the streets. The young king is too influenced by the Woodvilles. Richard means to protect him. Richard means to control him. Richard means to claim the throne. No, save the kingdom. No, destroy it. Truth slips between these competing narratives like a fish sliding through murky water. You feel the uncertainty pressing against your ribs. Anne stays by Richard's side during council meetings. Though she rarely speaks, she watches, always watches, the shifting expressions of nobles, the tightening of fists, the poorly concealed rivalries. She understands more than they realize. Her life has trained her to read the silent language of court politics better than most princes ever could. Then comes the moment history will cling to forever. The two young princes, Edward and Richard, are taken to the Tower of London for their protection. It's a phrase Anne has heard before. A phrase that rarely means what it says. And here, in the echoing chambers of the tower's outer walls, she feels a chill seep into her bones. She knows the tower is not always a prison, not always a place of doom. Sometimes it is simply where royalty stays before coronation. History loves drama, but reality is often more complicated. Yet she also knows this truth. The moment children are placed at the center of political power, the world becomes both sharper and darker. Whispers spread like wildfire through the court. Where are the princes? Why hasn't the elder been crowned yet? Why are the boys not seen? What does Richard intend? Some claim the boys are simply being protected from Woodville conspiracies. Others say their presence is too dangerous to be public. Still others, quietest of all, suggest darker possibilities. Even you feel the pressure of the world's suspicion settling around Anne and Richard like smoke. Historians still debate what truly happened within those walls. What choices were made, what dangers were real, what motives drove each action. But Anne sees something most people never consider. Richard is cracking under the weight. Not politically, emotionally, quietly, internally. A chasm opening where certainty used to be. One night, Anne finds him in the dim chamber overlooking the Thames, staring at the water with the expression of a man trying to solve a problem with no right answer. When she steps beside him, he doesn't speak, he simply breathes, slow and heavy. "You carried too much alone," she whispers. He closes his eyes. "There are things I cannot explain. Not yet." "I know," she replies. And the words are simple truth, not accusation, not fear, not suspicion. A lesser-known detail emerges here. Some accounts suggest Anne prepared a small handwritten prayer for the princes, placing it quietly in the chapel beneath a candle. Whether this is fact or gentle legend, historians still debate, but you see her kneeling there now, head bowed, whispering names with a tenderness born not of politics, but of empathy. Whatever is happening in the tower behind those guarded doors, Anne feels the tremors of it moving through Richard, through the court, through the very air. The woman who has spent her life in shadows is now standing beside a man who will soon be blamed, or remembered, as one of history's most enigmatic figures. And as you watch her exhale into the flickering candlelight, you sense it. The shadows around her are about to deepen. Again, you follow Anne into a world that grows denser and heavier with each passing day. As if the corridors themselves are thickening around her with whispers she isn't meant to hear, and yet hears all the same. The court shifts, murmurs, gossips, recoils. Every noble face seems carved from tension. Every step echoes with too much meaning. And Anne moves through it all with the careful grace of someone who knows shadows intimately, who has learned how to navigate them without ever letting them swallow her. Her new role, Queen in Waiting, though no one says it aloud yet, places her closer to the center of English power than she has ever been. But proximity does not mean clarity. If anything, the closer she gets, the less certain everything feels. You walk beside her through the palace halls, hearing fragments of conversation, advisors debating, nobles arguing, factions forming like cracks in a frozen river. And through it all, the question lingers like a ghost. Where are the princes? It is a question no one asks openly in Anne's presence, not yet. But she hears it anyway, slipping beneath doors, hissing between guarded glances. The tower looms in her mind even when she is miles away. Its gray stones seem to kneel on her chest at night, making her heart beat heavy. Whatever Richard knows, whatever he is wrestling with internally, he shares little, not because he doesn't trust her, but because the truth, whatever form it takes, has become too dangerous to speak aloud. Still, he tries to shield her from the worst of it. He finds a quiet moment with her in the council chamber one evening. Long after the last advisor has left, the room is lit by only a few candles, their flames bowing gently in the draught. Richard stands near the table, fingers pressed to the edge, as though grounding himself. Anne steps closer, her gown brushing the stone floor like soft whispers. "Anne," he says quietly. The council grows restless. The kingdom is listening for any sign of weakness. She studies him, the tension in his shoulders, the shadow beneath his eyes. "Then let them listen," she replies. "You have never been weak." He exhales a humorless breath. "They think I'm taking the crown." "Are you?" she asks, not as an accusation, but a careful, necessary question. He pauses, looks at her, really looks at her. "If I do not," he finally says, "the realm may splinter. There are those who would seize the young king and use him as a weapon. There are those who would claim the throne themselves. England is poised on a knife's edge." You feel Anne absorbing each word, each implication. She knows too well what happens when kingdoms fracture. She has lived through the bloodshed of those fractures since childhood. "If you truly believe taking the crown will keep England from tearing itself apart," she murmurs, "then you must do what is necessary." It is not permission, it is solidarity, the kind she never imagined giving, and the kind he desperately needs. And so, in the weeks that follow, murmurs solidify into proclamations, arguments become declarations, and one day, quietly, firmly, with almost no spectacle at all, Richard accepts the crown. Anne becomes Queen of England. But not a queen like Elizabeth Woodville, radiant and center stage, not a queen like Margaret of Anjou, fierce and unyielding. Anne's queendom is something else entirely, subtle, shadowed, a gentle presence woven into the edges of power rather than displayed at its summit. You accompany her through the preparations, through the fittings of her coronation robes, through the rehearsals in Westminster Abbey. She moves like someone pulled between two worlds, one part duty, one part disbelief. Even the servants seem unsure how to approach her, torn between old perceptions and new expectations. On the day of the coronation, light falls through the stained glass windows in soft hues of ruby and sapphire. Anne feels it warming her shoulders as she walks down the nave. Richard at her side, the choir's voices rise around you like a tide, ancient and echoing. The scent of incense curls through the air, thick and sweet. Crowds watch with expressions ranging from reverence to suspicion. When the crown is placed upon her head, Anne does not tremble, not outwardly. But you feel the subtle shiver ripple through her. It's the feeling of being seen and unseen at once. Elevated, yet still overshadowed. Powerful, yet bound. Historians often write that Anne appeared fragile during her coronation. Some say she looked pale, distant, almost sorrowful. Whether this is true or simply the projection of later writers, you can't tell. But you see something different, her quiet endurance, the strength she hides behind calm eyes, the resolve she has built from years of surviving other people's wars. After the ceremony, she and Richard are celebrated in feasts filled with music, laughter, political flattery, and far too much wine. Nobles approach her with rehearsed compliments. Foreign envoys bow low, even political rivals force smiles. But Anne's attention drifts at times, toward the windows, toward the moonlit sky outside, toward thoughts she dare not speak. Because even as she sits beside her new husband, crowned and veiled and robed in silk, one truth breathes at the back of her mind. Two young princes are missing. And she will never truly escape that shadow. In the months that follow, Anne undertakes her duties with diligence. She travels with Richard, attends councils, meets petitioners, and presides over ceremonies. Her demeanor is steady, serene, unfailingly polite. People find comfort in her presence. Even nobles wary of Richard find her impossible to dislike. She is the gentle counterweight to his sharper edges. But behind that serenity lies exhaustion. Court life demands constant movement, constant visibility, constant performance. Anne gives what she can, but she often retreats afterward to quiet rooms, dim chapels, gardens cloaked in morning dew. She takes solace in routine tasks, embroidery, reading, feeding birds near the palace orchard. Richard notices her fatigue, and though he says little, he arranges lighter duties, shorter appearances, more rest. A lesser-known detail surfaces. Anne had a habit of offering small, secret acts of generosity, sending warm cloaks to widows, funding repairs of village wells, gifting herbs to the palace infirmary. She asked that these acts not be publicly announced, whether out of humility or a desire to remain unseen. Historians still debate, but the truth feels simple. Anne did not seek power. She sought purpose. Yet, no matter how quietly she lives, the doubts surrounding the princes grow louder. You hear the whispers in corridors, in taverns, in letters carried by nervous messengers. Some fear Richard has harmed them. Others swear he is protecting them. Still others claim they are hidden away for safety. Anne says nothing publicly. But at night, when the candles burn low, you see her eyes linger on the darkness beyond the windows. You hear her breath slow, heavy with unspoken questions she isn't sure she wants answered. The reality is this: Anne loves Richard, and Anne fears what loving him might mean. Still, she stays by his side. She supports him. She believes in the man she sees when they are alone, gentle, patient, considerate, a man shaped by duty and burden, not malice. But the crown weighs heavily on them both. And soon, the strain of royal duty, political suspicion, and personal sorrow will demand even more from her. Far more. Because the next chapter of her life is not about politics or crowns. It is about motherhood, and the fragile hope that her child might finally bring light into her shadowed world. You follow Anne into a gentler season, gentle only on the surface. Like a soft breeze hiding the approach of a long, cold storm, Middleham's towers rise against a gray sky. Familiar now, almost protective, but inside these walls, the rhythm of Anne's life begins to change. Her step slows, her breath deepens, a hand drifts more often to her abdomen, resting there with a quiet wonder she rarely allows herself. She is with child. The news spreads through the household in a shimmer of relief. Relief because a child means succession, stability, hope, and for Anne, it means something far more intimate, a chance to give the world a life untouched. At least briefly, by the brutality that shaped her own. You feel her hope as keenly as she does. Delicate and trembling, like a finch cupped in her palms. Richard is softer with her now. Though he thinks he hides it, he watches her more closely, offering an arm as they walk, shortening their journeys, insisting on warm fires in every room she occupies. Even his counselors notice. One jokes that the king is becoming predictable, always asking, "Has Anne rested? Does she have enough blankets? Does she look pale to you?" Richard just shrugs. unapologetic, and honestly, it's kind of sweet. Medieval kings aren't known for prenatal care. As the months pass, Anne grows quieter, but not withdrawn. You see her in sunlit chambers, mending small garments with pale blue thread. You find her in the garden, whispering hopes into the wind between breaths of lavender and sage. She moves differently, slower, steadier, as though aware that she carries not just a child but the fragile possibility of peace. And then, on a clear spring morning, her son is born. Edward of Middleham. The name alone feels like a promise, one that ties her past to her future. You watch Anne cradle the tiny child, her expression softening in a way you've never seen before. Her eyes shine with something warmer than hope, something close to joy. And Richard looks at the child as if a star has been placed in his hands. For a moment, Anne's world glows. But even joy carries shadows. Edward is small, too small. His breaths are fragile, his cry, thin. The midwives whisper behind closed doors, their tones cautious, measured. Anne hears them. Of course she does. She hears everything. Her hand tightens protectively around her son every time someone examines him, as if shielding him from the slightest stir of doubt. Historians still debate Edward's early health, whether he was born frail, whether he suffered an unnamed condition, whether the stress of Anne's life affected him. The records are scattered, incomplete, blurred by the biases of chroniclers. But standing with Anne in her dim chamber, hearing her whisper lullabies over the soft, delicate breaths of her son, you feel the truth. He is the center of her world. And now, that world is trembling again. Months pass. Edward grows, a bit. He smiles, a little. Anne clings to each tiny milestone with a quiet intensity that leaves your heart aching. She holds him often, rocks him gently, places him in soft sunlight, murmurs stories of birds and flowers and castles she once visited as a child. She hopes. Oh, how she hopes. But the court swirls with obligations that tug at her relentlessly. As queen, she must travel, she must appear, she must stand beside Richard at councils, ceremonies, and feasts. Anne manages these duties with grace. But each time she leaves Middleham, her thoughts remain tethered to her son. Some say she used to pause at the threshold before every journey, whispering a blessing over him, drawing a tiny symbol of protection near his crib. Whether fact or fragile legend, historians still debate, but watching her now, you believe it. And then, politics intrude, as they always do. The rumors about the missing princes sharpen into knives. Foreign powers grow restless. English nobles shift uncomfortably under Richard's rule. Trouble gathers like a storm over the northern hills. Richard needs his queen beside him more than ever. So Anne travels, more than her health allows. Long days on uneven roads. Cold chambers in stone keeps. Endless ceremonies. Endless faces. Endless scrutiny. You see weariness slip into her bones. She hides it expertly, with the quiet fortitude she has carried since childhood. But you feel the strain in the slowing cadence of her breath, in the way her hand sometimes grips her arm as though steadying herself from within. Richard sees it too. He tries to lighten her burdens, tries to keep her in Middleham. But England does not allow its queen that luxury. Not when the kingdom is fracturing again. Still, Whenever she returns to her son, it is as though the world resets. Anne sits by his crib until he wakes, touches his cheek with shaking fingers, breathes in the soft scent of milk and warm linen. She holds him close, feeling his tiny heartbeat against her chest, grounding herself in the one pure anchor in her life. But the truth is impossible to ignore. Edward grows weaker. His small frame remains small. His energy wavers. Some days he is lively enough to giggle. Other days he lies quietly, fatigue settling into him like an early winter frost. Physicians murmur theories. Attendants try not to look worried. Richard asks question after question, his voice tightening with each uncertain answer. One night, Anne sits beside Edward's crib long after everyone else has gone to bed. The only light is a single candle, its flame fluttering against the draught. She hums softly, an old melody from her childhood, something her mother once sang. Her voice trembles. "I would trade every crown in this kingdom," she whispers, "for your health." You feel her truth vibrating in the stillness. Her greatest fear is not political collapse. It is loss. It has always been loss. A lesser-known detail emerges. Some say Anne began visiting the Middleham chapel each morning, leaving small offerings, flowers, a scrap of embroidered cloth, a candle lit for her son's strength. She asked no one to accompany her. She prayed alone. Whether this is historical fact or merely a tender story woven in later generations, you can't be sure. But in this moment, watching her fingers tighten around the crib rail, it feels undeniable. As winter settles over England, Anne senses what she cannot bear to name. Her son's breaths grow softer, shallower. His tiny hands lose warmth quicker than they should. She watches over him day and night. Richard, too, sits beside the child, his face shadowed in a way that frightens even his closest advisors. Anne's world narrows to a single room, a single cradle, a single, fragile heartbeat. You stay with her as snow falls outside the windows, muffling the world in white silence. You feel her fear coil inward, sharp and raw. Because Anne Neville, the girl raised in shadows, the woman shaped by duty and loss, is about to face a heartbreak deeper than any crown or kingdom can mend. Snow presses against the windows of Middleham like a soft, relentless hand, blurring the world beyond into pale smudges of white and gray. Inside, the castle feels even quieter than usual, too quiet, as if holding itself still out of respect or dread. You walk beside Anne through the narrow corridor toward her son's chamber, and each step feels heavy, deliberate, measured. She already knows. Her body knows. Her breath knows. But her heart is fighting the knowledge with every beat it has left. When she enters, the room is warm, warmer than the rest of the keep, thanks to the fire burning fiercely in the hearth. But warmth does not reach Edward. Her boy lies on a small bed tucked against the wall, his face pale, his breaths thin as spider silk. A physician sits nearby, head lowered, whispering words that blend into the crackling of the fire. Richard stands beside the bed with both hands clasped behind him, the posture of a king, but the expression of a father trying not to shatter. Anne crosses the room without speaking. She sits at her son's side and takes his tiny hand into her own. It is light, too light, and cool along the fingertips. She presses her lips gently to his knuckles, breathing as though trying to give him life through the softness of her touch. "Edward," she whispers, "my little love." The boy stirs slightly, eyelids fluttering like a tired bird. For a moment, Anne's hope lifts, fragile, trembling, but his chest rises only faintly. You feel her hope crack even before she does. Richard's composure splinters for a second too, his jaw tightens. His breath hitches, but he steadies himself. He always steadies himself for her. The physician murmurs something about fever, about weakness, about how some children cannot survive harsh winters even with all the care in the world. But Anne barely hears him. Her entire being is focused on the weight of her child's hand. The softness of his breath, the rhythm of his heartbeat. Time melts strangely in the room. Minutes stretch, bend, twist. Snow falls outside in endless silence. A draft stirs the candle flames. Richard kneels finally, resting a hand on Anne's shoulder. Not as a king, and not as a man who must offer strength to the world, but as someone who can no longer pretend he is composed. "He knows we are with him," Richard says quietly. Anne nods, but her eyes never leave her son. She hums a lullaby, not the grand, courtly songs nobles like to boast about, but something older, simpler, a tune from her childhood at Warwick Castle. Something her governess once sang while brushing tangles from her hair. The melody shakes, breaks, comes together again. Edward's breathing slows. Anne leans forward, pressing her cheek to his. Richard bows his head. And then, in a moment so soft it barely disturbs the air, Edward breathes out, and does not breathe in again. The silence that follows is not the peaceful kind. It is the kind that pierces. The kind that steals breath from your lungs. Anne's hand stays fixed around her son's. Her body remains perfectly still, as though movement might scatter the remnants of his presence. Richard closes his eyes, a long exhale breaking through him like a man knocked to his knees by unseen force. Anne does not weep immediately. She just stops. Every part of her sinks inward, collapsing into a grief so profound it cannot find voice. You feel it radiate from her like a sudden cold wind, stealing warmth from the room. She curls forward slightly, forehead resting against her son's still chest, her fingers trembling. Richard reaches for her, but gently, tentatively, as if approaching a wounded animal. His hand rests on her back. She leans into it, barely, the faintest shift of weight acknowledging that she is not alone in this loss. When her tears finally come, they are silent, the kind that fall without sound, without breath. Without any part of the world noticing except the person who loves her most. Richard wipes one from her cheek with his thumb. His own eyes are red. It is the only time you see him unmasked, truly unmasked, before Anne. Rumors later whisper that the entire household cried that night, that servants placed candles in the windows, that some knights sat in the courtyard with shoulders bowed, sharing a grief too deep to conceal. Whether this is romanticized or true, historians still debate, but standing here with Anne now, feeling the castle's air shift and dim around her, you believe it. Because Edward's death is not the loss of a prince. It is the loss of the only bright, hopeful place in Anne's life. She stays beside her son until the fire burns low, whispering lullabies, stories, prayers, apologies, words meant only for him. Richard eventually lifts her gently, guiding her away from the small bed. She hesitates, her hand hovering over her son's hair, then lets herself be led out. Steps slow, dragging. The corridors feel different now, longer, colder, hollowed of meaning. Anne's grief follows her like a heavy cloak. She moves through the castle as though walking underwater, slow, breathless, shrinking inward. Richard does everything he can. He stays with her, keeps the court at bay, holds her hand when she trembles, arranges time alone for her, time with him, anything he thinks she might need. But grief is not something that can be fixed, especially not grief like this. And so Anne begins to fade. Not dramatically, not suddenly. It happens quietly, the way leaves curl inward before falling. Her voice grows softer. Her laughter, rare already, disappears entirely. She eats little, sleeps poorly, walks less. Her body, always delicate, grows weaker. Attendants whisper concerns to Richard, who tries to hide the panic rising inside him. A lesser-known detail appears. Some accounts say Anne began to wear a bracelet with a single bead carved from bone, an old mourning custom symbolizing the soul of a lost child. Whether fact or tender legend, you can imagine her touching it with trembling fingers in the middle of the night. Richard watches her decline with a helplessness he cannot bear. He can command armies. He can hold a kingdom. But he cannot save Anne from her grief. One evening, you find her in the chapel, kneeling on the cold stone floor. A candle burns beside her, the flame wavering. She prays, not for strength, not for the kingdom, not for clarity. She prays for her son. And for the first time since Tewkesbury, you hear her whisper words shaped by despair rather than fear. Why must everything I love fade? No one answers. Not the candle, not the stone walls, not even the quiet air. But the truth hangs there all the same. Anne Neville, Queen of England, is breaking. And the kingdom will feel the fracture long before she speaks of it. Winter loosens its grip on England. But the chill inside Anne never fades. Spring pushes pale green buds from the branches outside the palace. Yet she walks through the corridors wrapped in a quiet that feels too deep. Too cold, too much like an empty room after the last candle sputters out. You stay near her as she moves, slowly, softly, through the world, as though she fears her footsteps might disturb something delicate or already broken. Richard watches her with an ache he cannot hide anymore. He tries to bring warmth into her days, musicians in the great hall, flowers from the palace gardens, embroidered cushions, gentle conversations, small gifts he pretends are inconsequential. But grief is a tide that pulls at the edges of Anne's spirit, dragging her farther from the shore each day. And as her light dims, the world around them grows sharper, hungrier. Whispers rise at court like smoke from a smoldering fire. The queen is ill. The queen grows weaker. The queen may not recover. If Anne dies, what will Richard do? And the whisper beneath those whispers, the one no one dares say outright. Would Richard take a new wife? Perhaps one with more political advantage? Perhaps one named Elizabeth? It begins softly, almost humorously. Court gossip floating between ladies as they stitch banners, but it spreads fast. The idea that Richard might set Anne aside or seek an annulment or remarry for alliance grows into a rumor so large it feels alive. You see the flicker of it in candlelit corridors. Hear it behind half-closed doors. Sense it rippling through nobles and servants alike. Anne hears it too. Of course she does. She hears everything. One afternoon, she sits by the window of her chamber, fingers tracing the frost-misted glass. Her hand shakes. You can see the way the rumors twist inside her, echoing sharp and deep. It isn't jealousy that troubles her. It's something quieter, more devastating. The fear that she is becoming a burden. The fear that she is fading away from a husband who once brought stability into her storm-laced life. The fear that her love, soft, fragile, hard-earned, is no longer enough. Her voice, when she speaks, is barely audible. If I disappear, she whispers, what becomes of him? You want to tell her she is not disappearing. But she is, slowly, painfully, like the thinning wax of a candle that has burned too long. Richard enters the room moments later. His expression shifts immediately when he sees her pale face, the tense line of her shoulders. He crosses to her, kneels beside her chair, takes her trembling hand in his own. Anne, he says softly, these rumors, they are lies. She tries to smile. The attempt nearly breaks you. I know what people say. She murmurs. I know what a king must consider. He shakes his head sharply. Not with you, never with you. But the words, though true, cannot banish the ache inside her. She has lived her entire life in the shadows of men's ambitions, her father's, Margaret's, Clarence's, Edward's. She knows how quickly a woman can be replaced, how easily her existence can be rewritten. And she is tired. So tired. Richard's thumb traces the back of her hand. Slow and careful. I swore a vow to you. He says, I will keep it until my last breath. Anne closes her eyes. A single tear slides down her cheek, neither dramatic nor loud. Just a small, glistening truth. Richard brushes it away gently. Do you believe me? He asks. She opens her eyes again, meeting his gaze. I want to. The honesty of it hits him harder than a blow. After he leaves, believing she needs rest, Anne remains by the window. Her breath fogs the glass. You sense her mind drifting, not into despair exactly, but into resignation, a quiet acceptance that her life is slipping beyond her control again. Just as it always has. But she does not collapse. She endures. She always endures. In the following days, her health flickers like a candle struggling against a draft. Some days she walks a little farther, her steps quiet but purposeful. Other days she stays in bed, breath shallow, hands cold, eyes unfocused. Physicians come and go, offering tonics, prayers, reassurances that carry the hollow ring of unspoken fears. A lesser-known detail appears here. It said Anne began wearing a small silver charm shaped like a dove, a gift from Richard early in their marriage. She keeps it under her gown, touching it whenever her breath grows thin or her thoughts darken. Its meaning is unclear, peace, hope, remembrance, but she clings to it as though it tethers her to something brighter. And still, the rumors grow. Foreign envoys whisper of alliances Richard might pursue. English nobles watch Anne with pity or calculation. Even everyday servants speculate in hushed tones about whether the king will remarry if fate takes its course. Anne hears each whisper like a pinprick. Her decline quickens. Her skin cools. Her voice thins. Her hands tremble more often. She eats less, sleeps more. Even sunlight seems too heavy for her to bear. The chapel becomes one of the few places she still visits, slipping in quietly to light candles for her son. For peace, for strength she no longer possesses. Richard orders all unnecessary travel cancelled. He personally dismisses gossip mongers from court. He stays with her through long, cold nights, reading softly, brushing her hair, resting his forehead against hers in moments when he thinks no one is watching. But love cannot fight illness. Not hers. Not now. One night, after days of worsening fever, Anne wakes suddenly, gasping. Richard is at her side immediately. You feel her struggling for breath. Each inhale jagged, painful. Her hand reaches blindly. Richard catches it, folding her fingers into his palm. Her voice is barely a whisper. Will you stay? His breath breaks. Always. She tries to smile. This time, the curve of her lips is real. Soft. Fleeting. You've been kind, she murmurs. Kinder than anyone. Anne. She interrupts him gently. I am not afraid, only sorry. Sorry for what? For leaving you alone. The words hit him like a blade. He bows his head, shoulders trembling once. You are not leaving me. Not yet. But you feel the shift inside her, a loosening. A soft release. She knows. You know. Even Richard knows. Her time is slipping away. And soon, England will lose its quiet queen. Richard will lose the only person who understood his silence. And Anne Neville, the girl born into ambition, married into war, crowned in shadows, will slip gently into the fading light. The dawn comes pale and brittle, casting a thin wash of color over the chamber where Anne lies. You stand beside her as the light moves slowly across the floor, touching the foot of her bed, then her blankets, then the curve of her cheek. It should warm her. It doesn't. She seems smaller somehow, curled into herself, her breaths shallow and uneven. The physicians have stopped offering reassurances. They hover in the background now. Hands clasped, voices muted, even they can feel it, the quiet, inevitable pull of something drawing nearer. Richard has barely left her side. His clothes are wrinkled, eyes shadowed, shoulders slumped under the weight of sleepless nights. He presses a cool cloth against Anne's forehead, whispers to her even when she can't fully respond, steadies her trembling hands with his own. This is not the king the world sees. This is simply a man who is losing the last piece of his heart. Anne opens her eyes when she senses him there. The effort costs her, but she still does it. Still tries. Her gaze meets his with a soft, searching clarity, as if she's trying to memorize his face in these final days, the shape of his eyes, the tremor in his breath, the sorrow etched deep into lines he never had before. You should rest, she whispers. You know I won't, he replies. She lets out a faint exhale that might have been a laugh in a healthier time. You've always been stubborn. He brushes a stray lock of hair from her forehead, his fingertips trembling. I learned it from you. It isn't true, but he says it anyway. Because even now he wants to ease her burden. Give her the dignity of strength she so often felt she lacked. You feel the tenderness in the room like a fragile thread, shimmering but stretched too thin. Later that day, attendants help Anne sit up so she can take a little broth. She can't lift the bowl herself anymore, so Richard does it for her, slowly, carefully, as though feeding her too quickly might break her further. She sips once, twice, then shakes her head. Enough. He doesn't argue. He wipes her lips gently with a cloth. You watch the way her eyes soften, the way her shoulders loosen, as if even this simple care feels like a balm. But illness creeps deeper. Anne's cough grows wet, ragged. Her fever spikes again. She withdraws beneath the blankets, shivering despite the fire roaring in the hearth. Her breaths come shorter now, each inhale a little thinner than the last. You feel her slipping, not all at once but in pieces, the sharpness of her gaze, the steadiness of her hands, the clarity of her voice fading one by one. And still, court whispers buzz like flies behind closed doors. If the Queen dies, will Richard take another bride? Will he seek a foreign alliance? Will he marry Elizabeth Woodville's daughter? Anne hears these rumors even when no one speaks them aloud in her presence. They move through the walls, carried on the worried breath of ladies in waiting, on the urgency of council meetings Richard tries to shield her from. She knows what her death will mean for England, and she fears, deeply, what it will mean for Richard. Not because she thinks he will betray her memory, but because she knows what grief does to a person, what it did to her, what it is doing to him now. She worries he will be swallowed by it, swallowed by the political vultures waiting to tear apart whatever remains of his reign. One night, close to midnight, you find Anne awake, staring toward the window where moonlight drips down the frame in thin silver stripes. Her breathing is shallow, but her eyes are lucid, too lucid. She reaches weakly for the edge of the blanket. "Help me sit," she whispers. Richard is there in an instant, guiding her gently into his arms and lifting her just enough so she can lean against him. She rests her head on his shoulder, her cheek pressed to the embroidered crest on his tunic. "I had a dream," she murmurs. "I was in the garden." Richard's hand stills on her back. "Middleham's garden?" A faint smile touches her lips. "Yes, with the rosemary and the sparrows." Her voice thins. "Edward was there, laughing." Richard's breath catches, and for a moment, he is no longer a king. He is a father hearing the echo of a lost child. He presses his forehead to her temple, eyes clenched shut. "He's waiting," Anne whispers, barely audible. "He's safe." The words feel like a confession, or perhaps a release. As the fever worsens, Anne drifts in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she murmurs to Richard. Sometimes she calls faintly for her son. Sometimes she simply lies still, breathing as though each breath is a decision she must make anew. Then comes the moment that breaks him, and you. Anne stirs, half conscious, her hand searching weakly through the blankets. Richard takes it immediately, holding it to his chest. "If I go before you," she says, her voice thready as candle smoke, "do not let them harden your heart." He shakes his head, tears streaking silently. "Don't speak like that. You must," she whispers. "Promise me, you'll be gentle." "Anne." She squeezes his hand with the last of her strength. "For me." He bows his head until his forehead rests against her fingers. I promise. It is the hardest vow he will ever swear. A few hours later, near dawn again, as the sky begins to brighten with a gray, reluctant glow, Anne struggles for breath. Her chest rises, falls, rises again, each movement smaller than the one before. Richard holds her upright, supporting her as though holding her body together might keep her soul from slipping out. Her eyes flutter open one last time. She looks at him, not at the king, not at the burdened man who has carried England on his back, but at the boy she once saw in Middleham, quiet and sincere. Richard, she breathes. He presses her hand to his cheek. I'm here. Her lips part as if she wants to say more, but the words never come. Anne exhales softly, and her body stills. The silence that follows is absolute. Not the peaceful silence of sleep, but the heavy, crushing silence of absence. Richard holds her long after her breath has left her, his shoulders trembling as he bows over her. No attendants enter, no physicians interrupt. The world gives him this moment, this last, unbearable moment with the woman who steadied him, softened him, understood him. Later, people will say she died of consumption. Others will claim grief stole her strength. Some whisper poison, others murmur curses. Historians still debate the truth. But here, in this room, you know exactly what took her. A lifetime of shadows. A heart that gave more than it ever received. And love so deep it hollowed her out when it was taken from her. Anne Neville, Queen of England, is gone. And the kingdom is about to unravel in ways neither she nor Richard could ever have prepared for. The chamber is impossibly still. You stand beside Richard as he remains at Anne's bedside long after her final breath has faded into the cold morning air. The light creeping through the window is gentle, almost apologetic, but Richard does not lift his head to meet it. He holds her hand, now cool, now still, with a reverence that breaks something inside you. He presses her knuckles to his forehead, to his lips, to his chest, as though trying to anchor her spirit to his own. But she is gone. The woman who saw him without fear. The woman who softened his sharpest shadows. The woman who knew grief so deeply she could recognize it even in others. The woman who loved quietly, steadfastly, despite a life that rarely loved her back. When Richard finally releases her hand, he does so as if severing a part of himself. Word spreads through the castle with a hush so complete it feels like a prayer. Servants stop mid-step, courtiers lower their voices. Even the draft seems to slip more gently under the doors. One chambermaid brings her apron to her face and weeps. A guard bows his head, helmet tucked beneath his arm. A nurse who helped tend young Edward sinks onto a chair, shoulders shaking. They mourn not just their queen. They mourn the kindness that had lived in her, rare and precious as a bird in winter. Richard does not attend the council meeting scheduled for that morning. Instead, he withdraws to his private chamber, silent except for the slow, heavy rhythm of his breath, too unsteady for a king, too human for a legend. You follow him, feeling the heaviness of the empty room where Anne once rested, her presence lingering like a soft imprint on the air. He sits at the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together tightly enough that his knuckles pale. His crown lies on the table beside him, forgotten, irrelevant, The duties of kingship stand politely at the threshold, waiting for him to have the strength to acknowledge them again. But strength is absent today. Outside, the sky darkens. Clouds roll low, thick and somber, as though reflecting the grief that has settled over Middleham. The castle's flags hang limp without wind. The air tastes of iron and frost. Hours pass before Richard moves. He rises slowly, as if his bones have aged years in a single morning. He walks to the window and places a hand against the cold glass. Looking down at the courtyard Anne once crossed with her soft, measured steps, you can almost hear echoes of her presence, the rustle of her gown, the faint tap of her slippers, the gentle way she greeted anyone who bowed to her. Everything feels different without her. Richard whispers. It is not a statement to you. It is a confession to the empty air. He closes his eyes. I do not know how to be without her. The admission fractures your heart. Richard, so often painted as ruthless, calculating, ambitious, reveals a truth few would ever see. He is a man carved from loyalty, not cruelty, and now that loyalty has nowhere left to go. In the days that follow, arrangements must be made. Anne's body is prepared for burial, her gown replaced with something pale and simple, her hair brushed and braided in the soft style she once preferred before grief dimmed her radiance. Attendants lay rosemary and white lilies near her hands. Richard requests that her silver dove charm, the one she touched during her last days, be placed beneath her fingers. It is a symbol of peace, perhaps even release. When Richard enters the chapel to see her one final time before the coffin is closed, he does not speak, he simply kneels beside her, head bowed, shoulders shaking in a silent grief so raw you feel your own breath stutter. He touches her hand, not to hold it, not to cling, just to feel her presence one more time. You deserved a gentler life, he murmurs. The coffin is sealed, and with it, something essential in Richard seals too. Anne's funeral is quiet but dignified. Nobles gather, clergy chant long, somber prayers. The cold stone of the church seems to absorb every word. You walk at Richard's side, feeling the chill of early spring seep into your bones. People watch him closely, too closely, for any glimpse of weakness, any hint of political intention. He gives them nothing. Not coldness, not anger, not ambition, just grief. A pure, staggering grief that makes his crown look heavier than it ever did before. Some later chroniclers wrote that Richard openly cried at her funeral, breaking royal decorum. Others insist he maintained composure, expressing sorrow privately. Historians still debate the truth. But here, in this moment, you see the bare honesty of his loss. Tears slip down his cheek as the final prayer echoes through the vaulted ceiling. When the procession ends and the last candle is extinguished, Richard stays behind, alone. You stand at the threshold of the chapel with him, watching as he places a single sprig of rosemary, Anne's favorite herb, on her grave. For remembrance, he whispers. The words tremble. He remains kneeling long after the others have left. Long after the cold begins to creep into the chapel. He remains until the silence becomes unbearable. Until the last glow of daylight fades entirely, leaving him in darkness. You feel the shift inside him, like the cracking of ice on a frozen river. Part of him has died with her. In the weeks after Anne's passing, the court grows uneasy. Her absence is felt everywhere, in the hollow quiet of her unused chambers, in the diminished warmth of the great hall, in the shadow that settles over Richard like a cloak he cannot remove. Rumors flare again, sharper than before. The king will remarry. He must remarry. He needs an heir. He cannot rule alone. Elizabeth of York could unify the kingdom. The queen is barely in her grave. Two things break your heart. Anne would have heard these whispers. Richard hears them now. But he ignores them, almost defiantly. Where others see strategy, he sees betrayal. In his heart, Anne is still with him, in the quiet of the gardens, in the chambers they shared, in the soft echo of her footsteps he sometimes imagines behind him. He visits her resting place often. Sometimes he stands in silence. Sometimes he speaks softly, as though she might somehow still hear. Sometimes he simply sits, shoulders hunched, hands folded, as if waiting for the pain to ebb. It doesn't. Not really. Not ever. And soon, the grief that clings to him will merge with something even darker. Something stirring on the horizon. Something gathering weight in the form of armies and banners and ambition. Bosworth. But for now, just for these final quiet moments, Richard remains here. Beside Anne's memory. The shadowed queen who lived and loved and suffered quietly. Who never sought power. Who moved through history like smoke through candlelight. She is gone. And Richard's world is smaller, colder, and infinitely lonelier because of it. You feel the shift almost immediately after Anne's burial. The way the world moves differently around Richard now. As if orbiting a man partially hollowed out. Grief is not loud in him, it is a quiet gravity. A heaviness carried in the slope of his shoulders. The slower cadence of his steps. The pauses in his breath when certain memories brush too close. England senses it too. A king in mourning is a vulnerable king. And the kingdom, so often restless, easily swayed, begins to mutter again. But before the storm truly gathers, something else happens, a strange, lingering silence after Anne's death, like a held breath that no one quite knows how to release. You follow Richard through the palace corridors where her absence is everywhere. The chambers where she embroidered. The garden where she once watered herbs. The chapel where she whispered prayers. All of it feels dimmer now. As if the world itself is politely mourning. And yet, outside these walls, the murmurs thicken. Anne's death is an omen. The king has no heir now. England is cursed. Richard is cursed. The princes? Those last whispers coil around every conversation like smoke. You walk with Richard one evening as he moves through the shadowed halls of Nottingham Castle. His gait is steady, but you feel the steep cliff beneath every step. He stops at a window, looking out across the dark countryside where faint lights from distant cottages flicker like wandering souls. You miss her, you murmur, though it feels less like a question and more like stating the obvious. He closes his eyes. There is no part of my life she did not soften. A pause, even the wounds. Anne's absence touches everything, the way he eats less, sleeps less, speaks less. He attends council meetings with a blade-like efficiency that unsettles everyone. His grief has sharpened him, not dulled him. And that sharpness cuts both ways. Some nobles whisper that he is turning cold. Others insist he is simply surviving. You know the truth. He is protecting what remains of himself the only way he knows how. But grief has a way of interacting with power, dangerously. One morning, a letter arrives from the south. You watch Richard unfold it, the wax seal cracking like a bone under pressure. His eyes scan the parchment, darkening slowly, like storm clouds thickening before rainfall. Henry Tudor has gathered supporters in Brittany, more by the day. And in England, discontent is rising. Nobles begin to whisper about fate, about curses, about whether a childless king can truly secure the realm. They do not blame Anne, but they use her death as a convenient symbol. You feel Richard's jaw tighten each time her name is tossed into political rhetoric. He will not allow her memory to be used as a weapon. And yet, it already is. In the following weeks, Anne's ghost settles everywhere, not haunting, not ominous, but present, like a cold draft beneath the door. Richard visits her resting place whenever he can, always placing Rosemary, her symbol, beside her stone. He kneels longer each time, sometimes in silence, sometimes whispering. You would know what to say. He murmurs once, voice cracking, "You always did." But no answer comes, only the soft rustle of leaves, the distant caws of rooks circling the ruins of old battlements. A lesser-known detail floats up from chroniclers later. Some claimed Richard kept a small token of Anne's, a ring, or a braid of her hair bound in ribbon, inside his doublet. Close to his heart, even during council sessions, whether fact or rumor, you see him reach into his tunic sometimes, fingers brushing something small, something precious, perhaps an anchor, perhaps a wound. Anne's death also shifts the court's balance. Without her steady, gentle influence, Richard grows more isolated. Fewer people speak to him with honesty. More feed him half-truths. And the Woodvilles, still smarting from their fall, stoke foreign sympathy, hinting darkly at the fate of the princes in the Tower. The whispers twist into sharp theories. Richard killed them. Richard hid them. Richard lost control of his own council. No one knows, not even the king. Even historians centuries later will tear at this knot, pulling threads that lead nowhere. But Anne, had she still been alive, would have seen something others missed. The weight of guilt and grief often look the same from a distance. One night, you find Richard alone in the council chamber. No guards, no advisors, just a man staring at a map of England as though the parchment itself is slipping away from him. His fingers hover over the borders. His shoulders slump. "They think I wanted this," he whispers. "This?" you ask softly. "This emptiness." His voice barely holds together. He looks toward the door of Anne's old private chamber, the one no one dares enter now. "I would give this crown for one day more with her," he says. "One day." And you believe him. Some rulers are defined by ambition. Richard is defined by loss. As spring surrenders itself to summer, England itself begins to fracture. Noblemen shift allegiances. Some flee abroad. Some gather troops quietly. The Tudors grow bolder, sending letters promising restoration, stability, hope. That cruel, slippery word that has been dangling out of Richard's reach since Anne died. At court, Everyone pretends to be calm. But everyone feels the tremor. One afternoon, a messenger rushes into the hall, breathless and pale, bearing news. Henry Tudor is preparing to invade. Richard straightens, pain sharpening into focus. His grief does not vanish, but it condenses, hardens, becoming something like resolve. He stands before the council, voice steady. We ride south. Murmurs ripple, some in fear, some in anticipation, some with thinly masked doubt. But no one challenges him. You follow him later to the stables, where he readies his black destrier. His movements are precise, almost ritualistic. He adjusts the buckles himself, ignoring the hands of grooms. Every gesture whispers of control over the only things he can still command. Before mounting, he pauses. He turns toward the castle one last time, toward Anne's window. The sunlight touches the stone softly. Richard presses his palm to the hilt of his sword, as if steadying himself with her memory. I ride for England, he murmurs, and for you. His voice breaks on the last word. Then he mounts, armor glinting in the afternoon light. The hoofbeats of his horse echo like a heartbeat fading into distance. Anne Neville is gone, and with her goes the last soft tether anchoring Richard to the gentler parts of himself. Ahead lies only the grinding machinery of history. The storm building on the horizon. The battle that will define his legacy. And the shadow of Bosworth. Waiting, you feel the land itself tighten as Richard rides south, fields flattening under summer heat. Winds stiffening, crows circling low as if sensing some final reckoning on the horizon. The roads buzz with rumors of Tudor armies assembling, of disloyal nobles wavering, of omens swirling thick in the air. Every village you pass seems to pause, watching Richard's banners ripple in the wind as though trying to decide whether to cheer or pray. Richard rides with a grim purpose. Not frantic, not panicked, just sharpened. Like a blade honed too many times. Grief has stripped him of the softness Anne gave him. What remains is duty, pure, unadorned, and heavy as plate armor. You ride beside him through heavy heat. The sun presses down with an almost cruel insistence. Horses snort and paw the earth. Men murmur anxiously. Richard moves among them with the calm of someone who has decided that fear is a luxury he no longer deserves. Occasionally, his hand drifts toward his chest, where you know, because you have seen it, something of Anne's rests. A token, a memory, a small anchor against the rising tide. But memories cannot stop an army. And the Tudor force grows with each league you cross. Nottingham, Leicester, Market Bosworth. Each place feels heavier, closer, more final. When Richard reaches Leicester, crowds gather to watch him enter. You hear their whispers as he passes. He looks older. He rides like a man with nothing to lose. He rides like a man still grieving. They say he keeps his wife's charm over his heart. They say her death is an omen. People always look for omens before a battle. They always look for patterns that promise safety. For superstition that might explain catastrophe. And Anne, gentle, quiet Anne, has now become a symbol people grasp at wildly. Richard hears the murmurs. His jaw clenches, but he says nothing. He keeps riding. That night, he stays in a small chamber at an inn, refusing the larger, Grander rooms offered. You sit with him as he removes his armor piece by piece, laying each part on a wooden table. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, metal, and summer dust. He reaches beneath his tunic and pulls out the small silver dove charm, Anne's charm, and closes it in his fist. She would have hated this. He whispers. You can almost hear Anne's gentle voice echo in the background, a soft reminder that violence always takes more than it gives. Richard places the charm beside his sword, not to abandon it, but to honor it, a vow, a promise, a memory he refuses to leave behind. Later, in the dim, flickering candlelight, he sits alone, looking out the small window at Bosworth Field in the distance. The landscape lies quiet now, but tomorrow it will awaken in a storm of steel and screams. The quiet before battle is always a lie. It's just the world preparing to change. He speaks softly, as if Anne might somehow hear across the divide. Stay with me tomorrow. The words tremble. Then he closes his eyes. Dawn breaks sharp and merciless. Fog curls over the low ground. The sky blushes pink and gold. Birds scatter from the hedgerows. And across the field, the Tudor banners rise, red dragons spread wide, the wind snapping them like jaws ready to bite. Richard's forces spread out, but you hear the unease rippling through their ranks. Some of his nobles are loyal. Some are hesitant. Some, fatally, are quietly considering switching sides. Politics doesn't stop for funerals, or grief, or even battles. It slithers through everything, waiting to strike. Richard mounts his horse, a white steed today, blazing brighter than any banner. The sunlight catches on his armor, turning him into a gleaming figure that commands the field. For one brief, breathtaking moment, he looks exactly like the King England needed from the beginning, brave, focused, determined. He scans the field, lips pressed into a line. Then you hear him whisper, not to his men, not to God, but inwardly, to the memory that steadies him. For you, Anne. And the battle begins. It erupts like a storm hitting dry earth. Swords clash, horses rear, the ground shakes under the weight of charging lines. Arrows hiss through the air like angry insects. The noise is overwhelming, metal on metal. Cries of pain, shouted orders, the deep, guttural roar of men fighting for their lives. Richard rides like a force of nature. He moves through the chaos with a precision born not of recklessness but conviction. His men follow him, shouting his name as they push forward. At one point he nearly breaks through the Tudor line, cutting down standard bearers, scattering soldiers like leaves in the wind. He fights like a man possessed, one soldier cries. But it isn't possession. It's grief. Pure, channeled grief. Every swing of his sword carries the weight of Anne's absence. Every advance is driven by the desire to protect the legacy she believed in. Every shout is an echo of the promise he made at her bedside. Do not let them harden your heart. But battles don't care about promises. And Bosworth does not care about love. You feel the momentum shift when Lord Stanley, pretending neutrality until the last possible second, turns against Richard. His forces swell the Tudor ranks like a dark wave crashing onto an already strained shore. Richard sees it. He knows what it means. But instead of retreating, he drives harder, straight at Henry Tudor himself. "I will live or die king," he shouts, spurring his horse forward. And for a moment, just a moment, victory feels possible. He comes within yards of Henry. Yards. You can see Henry's pale, shocked expression as Richard barrels toward him. Richard cuts down Henry's standard bearer, splintering the Tudor banner beneath his blade. But then the tide hits. Fighting men surround him, too many. Too fast. His horse is dragged down. Richard stands, armor dented, sword raised, face streaked with dirt and blood. He fights on foot, roaring Anne's name in the silence of his heart. You feel every blow he takes, every strike he deflects, every breath he drags into his lungs. And when he falls, it is not as a villain, not as a tyrant, not as the twisted figure later legends will paint him as. He falls as a man who loved deeply, who grieved quietly, who fought fiercely, and who carried too many shadows for one lifetime. He falls as Anne's Richard. And the battlefield swallows the last king of the House of York.